Hello again, my friend. Welcome to the next section of the course. In this section, we are implementing weapons. Sam has been working his patootie off to get in a whole bunch of really cool basic weaponry for us. When I run into this next level, you can see I've got a sword now. What's really cool, when I run a little bit to the right, you'll see what the enemy is doing. He is shooting an arrow at us, which is really cool, very exciting. If I run up to the enemy, I've got a different animation for the sword. Super cool. The player can run over pickups. And with the pickups, we can do things like throw a fireball. So that switched my weapon to a fireball, which is casting, we'll call it a weapon in this instance, casting a weapon fireball. So we can switch between weapons when we run over pickups. We're not implementing full inventory in this section or even in this part of the course. For now, we want to make sure that we can have different weapons that we just run over on the ground, different animations, different ways of killing the enemies, and different ways of the enemies to hit us as well. So let's jump in and create some weapons for our game. Hi again, in this video we are going to be instantiating a big old sword, a little bit of a silly sword, if I do say so myself, in the player's hand so that we can run around with a weapon and start the whole journey of putting weapons into our game. So let's jump in and get started. For our player to wield a weapon, we need a concept of what, in other words, what weapon, and where, in other words, where is our player going to hold that. So I'm going to start by jumping over into my fighter script, fighter.cs, and we'll give ourselves two new fields in here, two new serialized fields. Serialize field. First one will be a game object, and I'm going to call that weapon prefab, because our weapons will be prefabbed. And I will initialize that at null, just so if we don't have a weapon equipped, the compiler knows that we deliberately don't have anything in there. For example, if we're just doing unarmed and we don't want a weapon. Now, second, we will serialize field. This one will be a transform, because it's a where. We need to know the location. And I'm going to call this hand transform, because I'll putting the weapon in the player's hand. And again, I'll initialize this at null. Save that up, jump back over into Unity. Now, what we need to do is to, first of all, identify where we are going to put that. So let's go into our player prefab, click on the little chevron arrowy thing to the right of the player prefab. And within here, we can see we've got our character model. I'm going to scroll through here. I'm using my arrow keys. Right arrow key expands, and down arrow key moves the indicator down. I'm just and looking for spine. Down, right. You can use the little clicky thing on the left here if you want. That's the official name for it, but I find this is quick when I'm looking for something. If you just hold down right, it just quickly expands out everything, and then you can go off and find what you're looking for. What we're looking for here is the hand. I'm going to put the weapons in the right hand. For now, later on we will have some weapons in the left hand, like the bow and arrow, but for now we're going to put it in the right hand. And underneath my right hand, I'm going to right click, create empty, and here I'm going to create a new game object. This will be, what's the weapon we're going to use first? I'm going to use a sword first, so I'm going to call this equipped sword. It's a new game object. Make sure that the equipped sword is at the 0, position, which it should be if you've just gone right click and created an empty game object. Now I'm going to go and find within my Cinti asset pack here, my prefabs, where are we? Right down the bottom, this sword, so SM Wep Sword 01, drag it to the hierarchy underneath equip sword. If you're using your own weapon, again, make sure that it's reset to 000. If you've got some weird numbers in here, then you're going to get all sorts of mischief when you try to rotate and stuff. So make sure the child is reset to being zeroed underneath the equipped sword. So now we can manipulate our sword within our equipped sword game object. The reason I've done it this way and staggered it is that what I want to do is go into play mode, move around the positioning of this sword, and have its position relative to the equipped sword game object, which I know is being childed right under the hand. So it's going to be in its correct position. You can see our indicator here, it's right under the hand. Now I can go in and monkey around with this sword to my heart's content knowing that it's going to follow around where the hand goes. And importantly, what I'm going to do is jump out of player, click on play, now go back into player, and at this point we're working on an instance of the player, not the prefab itself when we click on play. So as I go and find where is the root, hips, using my keyboard again, spine, clavicle, shoulder, elbow, hand, okay. and here I will find my equipped sword. These are all instances, so changes here aren't going to be applied back to my prefab, so I'm going to have to copy the value. So let's have a look. Where is it currently positioned? Not in the best spot, but we will, while clicked on this sword, I'm going to rotate it around, probably click on pause just so he's not wobbling too much. Rotate it around, get it into the right position. I find we need to have our weapons rotated quite a long way away from the player. If you're having trouble seeing it, if you've got some clipping plane issues, you can click F to zoom, to focus in on your weapon. And just get it into a pretty good spot that you're happy with. Okay, now what we can do is unpause, and as we run around, the sword should be in the correct position in the player's hand. It's kind of chopping his face off a little bit there, so what I'll do, click F just to get it into the right spot. Just going to rotate mine down a little bit so it's nearly touching the ground, and as he runs, okay, nearly bonks him in the head, but not quite. Awesome. The other thing I'm going to do for my sword, just because I think it looks funny and silly, is to scale it up. So I will take my scale and maybe make it 2, 2, 2. Okay, so we've got this really dumb, massive sword that he's running around. It's too long now, I think. The scale, what's that? The X? Nope, on the Y. So I make the Y a little bit shorter. I might want to make it kind of this big, fat Final Fantasy style sword that he's running around with that looks a little bit too heavy for him. Clunk, clunk, nearly banging on the ground. Excellent, 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 a dumb, funny way. Okay, there we go. So it's a little bit silly, a little bit funny, but that's the game that I'm going for here. Now, what we need to do before you click out of play mode, don't click out of play mode yet, is to right-click on transform, copy component. Now we can click out of play mode. Want to enter our player prefab again, find where we've got our equipped sword, and then click on underneath that, find the transform of the sword prefab itself, right-click, and paste component values, and that should be, there we go, he's got his sword. Now when I click on play again, we can run around when we click on play. It should all be copied in there as expected. Okay. Excellent. Now we need to make sure that is a prefab. So again, from within my player prefab, I'm going to make myself a new folder. Game, I will call this weapons. Create folder, weapons. And within weapons, I'm going to drag the equipped sword down. Excellente. Now that our sword is prefabbed, if you're going to edit it, I recommend that you click into the equipped sword. Now we're working on the prefab, the sword itself. If you want to make any changes to it, you can make some changes in here. Make sure you're editing the sword itself, so if you're wanting to change the position of it, if you've got some new values, change the sword itself. Don't be changing the equipped sword. We need to keep that at the 0 point sitting right on the hand, because any changes we make at the child level will be propagated to all of the equipped swords out there in the scene. Whereas if we make changes to the transform of the parent, of the equipped sword, it won't be propagated. It won't go and change any instances that we currently have in the scene, or other swords that our enemies, for example, might be wielding. Okay, hopefully that explanation made sense for you. If I jump back out into my game, you can see our player has the sword, it's sitting in his hand, but how do we instantiate this sword at runtime so we can in the future switch out our weapons? Well, that's going to be the challenge for you. I want you to instantiate the weapon in the hand. Create a spawn weapon method to instantiate a weapon in the player's hand when the game starts, and here is a hint for you. Instantiate takes in a what, and it takes in a where, which has been what we've been talking about up till this point. So in the fighter.cs script, spawn a weapon in the player's hand, and I'll see you back here when you're done. Rightio. So I'm going to, from within my player, I'm just going to delete this equipped sword. Blink, because we want to be instantiating at runtime, so we don't want him to be holding one already. Back out of player, over into my script. I'm going to do this in the start method. We want to have this straight away as the game starts, so start. Just tidy up my parentheses here, what are these? My curly braces. Tidy them up a little bit, and I'm going to create a new method, spawn weapon, parentheses, semicolon. This isn't created yet, so click on it. Control full stop or control period will allow me to generate method. And it's as simple as using instantiate, and then the what is going to be the weapon prefab, and the comma where is going to be the hand transform. Hand transform. Okay, semicolon, save that up. Now we've got a couple of things. I'm just going to move this down, actually. It's good coding practices, we believe, to have your start and update method right at the top. So underneath method, I'm just going to paste that new method spawn weapon we just created. So it's a little bit tidier. So we tend to go start and update, and then we have our public methods, then we have our private methods. Back over into Unity, what do we need to do? Well, we need to click on the player. Let's jump into the player prefab again. As Sam has reminded me a gazillion times, make sure we're working inside the prefab. Then we know it gets applied at the right level in the right way. Don't know if I clicked on the right thing just then. On the player, there we go. Now we want to find the fighter script. Currently the weapon prefab. Well, we'll drag in the equipped sword from our game weapons folder. And then we will find the hand, which is sitting on the player. I'm just going to grab the hand itself, drag that into hand transform, and there we go. And just a side note, we're going to be doing a lot more work with this. We'll be using scriptable objects. So this is just to get us underway, but in the future we'll be having this a lot more sophisticated. We won't just be dragging in a weapon, because we need it to change when, for example, the player picks up a weapon. Okay, so let's click. We'll see if the player has a sword in his hand. Hopefully he does. Fade in, there we go, Shazam. We got this big old sword, and if I can drag my window over a little bit, we can run over to the enemies, and they don't have weapons yet, but bam, we still doing our old animation. We're going to change that in upcoming videos, but we have a weapon. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and do exactly the same process and put the same weapon or other weapons into the hands of your enemies, and you may notice that we're getting some red errors. That's okay, that's because our enemies are instantiating weapons, but they don't have any weapons yet. That's fine, we'll be fixing that in the next video. So for now, that's it. We've got our first weapon. We're well underway, and I'll see you in the next video. In my previous video, I mentioned that we were going to jump in and do scriptable objects very soon. That was a little bit of a misdirection because we have one or two things I want to do before that. The first thing is to solve the problem we have of how to create different animations for our different weapons. So let's jump in and talk animations and get our character when he's swinging his sword. Instead of what he's doing now, he's doing his punch animation. We want to do a sword swing animation. So let's have a look at our animator. If you open up your animator window and have a look at our animator controller, you can see that we have locomotion, attack, death, all these kind of good things. What is happening at the moment is in our attack state, we have our unarmed attack animation, which is a valid animation if we want to punch. How are we going to go about creating a swing for our sword? Well, we could go and change in here and choose from our animation pack that we've brought in before. We could choose the sword attack. That'd be cool. But when we go and pick up a crossbow, when we pick up a mace or a spear, then each time we have a different weapon, we can't go and change in here beforehand and set up. We want that to happen at runtime within the game. Now there's a solution, and the solution is the Animator Override Controller. I've given you a link to this Unity documentation here so you can read up about it a little bit more. What we need to do is, let's find our game folder with weapons in it. I'm just going to create another folder here which I'll call Sword, because we're going to need to do this for each of our different weapons. So we'll chuck our Equip Sword in there. I'm going to right click and create Animator Override Controller. Okay, what is the animator? Well, I'll rename it first of all before I explain what's going on. This will be the Sword Override Controller is what I'll call that. Okay, excellent. So what is it doing? Well, with this override controller, you can see here it's taking in an animator controller. We've got the one at the moment, which is our characters. So let's go and find in my folder game and then characters. I've got my character animator controller. So we put that in there. It says, great, this is what I'm going to override. Now we get to choose which of the animations that are contained within our character animator controller, that's what we've got just here, which of these we wish to swap at runtime when our, where is it again, just here, when our sword override controller is being used. And we'll write a little bit of code shortly that will say which animator override controller we want to be using at what particular time. But here we can say, well, when we're in this sword, when we're using the sword override controller, when it's overriding our regular character controller, we wish to change from unarmed attack 3, instead of being unarmed attack, we want to find a sword attack. So I've just got this sword attack R6 in here. So we want to say, use this particular attack. we could change any of these. We could have a different depth, we could have different run and different idle, etc. So that's what the override controller is. At runtime, it's going to swap out this particular animation for the original animation. And obviously, we're going to have an override controller for each of our weapons that we wish to look different, that we wish to have a different animation for. So let's go and create the code that will use the override controller. And side note, I've noticed my errors that I said in the last video we'd fix in this video. We'll wait one more video before we fix those. We'll get to it, I promise you. But for now, let's go and find our scripts. We will look at our combat and fighter. We're going to put all these things in fighter for now, but in a couple of videos time we'll be creating a different class, which will be the weapon class. I'm not doing it just yet because that is what will be our scriptable object. So we're getting there, I promise you. There's method to the madness. First of all, we need to give ourselves an animator override controller variable. So let's serialize field. This will be animator override controller, and we'll call this weapon override. Override, got to remember the two R's in there. And again, we'll start this off at null. Now let's find where we're spawning our weapon. Underneath instantiate, I'll get a handle to the animator, and animator, and that will equal get component and of type animator. Okay, so it's just getting the animator, and then what we need to do is set this animator dot runtime animator controller equal to, see if you can figure out the rest of this, what will it equal? The weapon override. So our weapon override is the animator override controller we've just created, and we're going to set the runtime animator controller to be this weapon override. Let's save that up, and just another little micro challenge for you. See if you can complete the rest of it. Just pretty obvious change in the inspector here. What do you need to do to finish this off? Okay, well, we go into player, find our player. I'm going to go into the prefab of the player, and then on the fighter script we have the weapon override. The weapon override will be, let's see, in here, the sword override controller. Drop that straight in. Excellent. Save that up. Not save it up, click on play. I'm so used to saying save it up and click on play when I'm over in my script. Let's run over this way, see if we can find an enemy. Click on the enemy, and we're doing the big swing with the sword. Ha ha! There we go. Awesome. So we are changing the animation based upon our override controller. Very cool. Okay, just a straightforward video there introducing the animator override controller so that we have the pieces we need for the next video, where I promise you in the next video we will be jumping into the scriptable object for the weapons. Okay, great work, and I'll see you again soon. Hello again. At the end of this lecture, we will end up with exactly the same functionality as we have at the start of the lecture, that is running around with our big old sword, but we're going to be using scriptable objects for the data for our weapons. And you've probably encountered scriptable objects from our introductory Unity courses, but if not, just a reminder, scriptable objects are a data container. It's a way for us to keep a whole bunch of information. For us, it's going to be information about what weapon, so what damage does it do, what animator override does it have, what's the mesh, in other words, how does it look? And we can contain all of that in an asset that lives within our project folder. So we're going to start by, within our combat folder, creating a new class. So right click, create C# script, and we will call this weapon. We're going to open up our weapon, and in our weapon, instead of deriving from mono behavior, we are going to delete everything in here. We're going to create a scriptable object. Now, Visual Studio Code has a lovely autocomplete here. If we just start typing in scriptable, you can see scriptable object. If we click on that, it puts in all of this information in here. Now, let's just grab all of our code in here, cut that out, put in a namespace. So namespace, this is going to be rpg.combat. And then within our curly braces, we will paste the thing that we cut before. Okay, that all looks nice and sweet. So, okay, when we're creating a scriptable object, it has this menu system. See, the file name is weapon, and the menu name is RPG project / weapon. I'm going to change from this weapon, I'm going to change it to make new weapon. I'm going to change RPG project to weapons. Okay, you'll see what's going to happen in a moment. So weapons / make new weapon, jump back over into Unity. Now from anywhere in our assets area, I'm going to find my weapons folder and sword. Right click within our menu here, we have this new create weapons, make new weapon that I just added in my script a moment ago. And what are we going to call this? Well, this will be sword. So this is our scriptable object. It's our sword scriptable object, which is a .asset file. So let's put a couple of things in. I'm going to go and grab things from Fighter. We will grab the animator override controller. Just cut that and back over into weapon. Paste that in. Okay, what else do we need to grab from Fighter in here? I'm also going to grab the weapon prefab. So what we're doing here is grabbing anything that will change based upon what particular weapon we are wielding. So we want to have a different animation and we want to have a different weapon. We don't need to bring over, for example, the hand transform, because the hand transform is going to be the same whether it's a sword or whether it's a mace, or whether it's a spear. So we don't need to bring that over. And also in our weapon script here, we want to spawn the weapon. This is where we will actually instantiate it from this place. So we'll make this a public method. We'll be calling it from Fighter, most likely. Public void spawn. And we need to take in a couple of things. We already know what the weapon is. We don't need to take that in when something calls this. We need to know where. So transform, hand transform. And we also need to take in the animator. So we know where the animator is located. Animator. So those are the parameters we need to take in. And then we're going to instantiate, again, the weapon. We've done this before. I could have just copied over my code from Fighter and messed around with it, but just typing this out so it's super clear. And it's weapon prefab hand transform. And then we, as before, we want to override the animator. So animator dot runtime, runtime animator controller equals weapon override. So far we're just looking for two things, the animator override and the weapon prefab, and we are going to instantiate our weapon. Now over in Fighter, I'm going to scroll down to my spawn weapon method. We no longer need to instantiate the weapon from the Fighter. That will be instantiated from our weapon script, from our weapon class. But we need to do another couple of things here. First of all, up at the very top, I'm going to create a new variable, serialize field, and I will call this weapon. So that's our weapon class we've just created, and we'll call it variable weapon, and we will initialize that at null. So this means that the Fighter, at this stage, we're hooking things up very manually. We're going to get a lot more organic. We're going to have pickups and all those kind of things in the future. But for now, we're just saying, hey, which weapon scriptable object am I looking at? So that's why we've got this field just here. And down when we spawn weapon, let's protect against null. So if weapon equals null. What do we want to do? We want to return. Now we still need to be getting our animator, but the last line we need to update. So I'm going to give you a challenge, a bit of a different challenge here. It's really just, have you been following along? Does this make sense? Because I've jumped around a little bit pretty quickly. I just want you to finish off what we need to do here in spawn weapon. It's just a little bit of changing around of the code, and then to go into the inspector and make sure everything is hooked up correctly. Oh, I'll give you this as a slide actually. Tidy up our Fighter class and then make sure all our relevant fields have been assigned. So there's your challenge. It's a test to see that you've been following along and understanding what I've been talking about. Jump in, take that on, and I'll see you back here in a moment. Okay, so the last thing we need to do in our spawn weapon, instead of doing our runtime animator override just here, we instead are going to call weapon.spawn, because this is where we know it's being instantiated now. The weapon's being instantiated in our weapon script. And what do we need to pass in? Well, it's telling us hand transform and animator. So we're going to pass in hand transform, comma, animator. It's good when you use the same words, so it makes sense. Save that up. Make sure weapon is saved up as well. Jump over into Unity. Now we need to find the things that need to be hooked up. We've got our sword scriptable object. It's now looking for those serialized fields that we just created. So it's looking for the weapon override, and it's looking for the weapon pre. You know what? Instead of weapon override, this is animator override, isn't it? I'm just going to rename this F2 and animator override. Okay. I think that's going to be much better. Animator override, great. Save that up. And so we're taking in our animator override and we're taking in our weapon prefab. So the animator override, click on that. We only have one, the sword override controller, and then our weapon prefab, click on that. It's going to be sword, the equipped sword. Excellent. Now the last thing we find our player, jump on into the prefab for the player on the fighter script. It's looking for the weapon, so the scriptable object. For now, we're just going to manually give it to it, which is the sword, but in the future we'll be able to update that through a pickup and a few other things. So we've given it the sword, we'll save everything there, back out of player, click on play, we'll see if he has a sword in his hand. But he does indeed, and that is being driven by our sword scriptable object. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, that introduction to scriptable objects. As always, if you've got any questions, please do post them in our forum, in our discussions. We love to hear from you, particularly if we can help out, and I will see you in the next lecture. So again, in this video, we're going to create ourselves a second weapon. Technically, it's not a weapon, it's the unarmed weapon as a scriptable object, and we need to rearrange our scripts a little bit so that we have all of our relevant tweaking and tuning variables on our scriptable object so that we can be easily updating our data for our various weapons. If we want to change the damage on sword, we can do it there. If we want to change the damage for an unarmed hit, we can do it on unarmed range, etc. So let's jump in and get started. Let's continue with our scriptable object by bringing the other things from our fighter script over. You can see that we don't have the damage and the range, I think it is. Let's look in our fighter script. You can see, yeah, we've got weapon range and weapon damage. I want to have all of these within my weapon script, so we've got all the weapon things in one place. And I also need a way for my fighter script to still be calling and getting that information, so still be accessing range and damage. So I'm going to start off with a challenge for you. It should be reasonably straightforward, where I want you to move range and damage to the weapon class from the fighter class, and also to create two public getter methods, just very simple methods that return the value of damage and return the value of range. And then to update fighter.cs to call those public methods in the right place. So to make sure that we can still access range and damage from fighter. So there's your challenge. Jump in, take that on. I'll see you back here when you've given it your best shot. Okay, first of all, in fighter, let's go and grab our weapon damage variable, cut that out, and then, cut that out, you two, and then over to our weapon, paste that in, cut that out, you two, seems to be what I say to my kids a lot of the time, cut that out, stop fighting. Back over into fighter, we find range, cut that out, then over to weapon, and paste that in as well. Now, we need to make a couple of public getter methods, pretty straightforward. We have a public, and then we're looking for a return type of what is weapon damage. It's a float, and we'll call this get damage, parentheses, curly braces, and we will return in here weapon damage. Easy peasy. Now, let's copy get damage, because we're going to make a very similar method for get range. Rename this from get damage to get range, and from from weapon damage to weapon range. Okay. Clean my spaces up a little bit. Save, and then over into fighter, we need to find where we were using those. We should have some red squiggly lines somewhere. Okay, weapon damage and weapon range. These are no longer variables from within this class, so we need to be accessing weapon dot get, what's this, damage, and then over parentheses at the end, and then weapon range. In my get is in range method, I will change this to weapon dot get range. Okay, save that up. Pretty straightforward. Hopefully that has been straightforward for you. Back over into Unity. Let's see what's going on when I click on play. Okay, you can see the sword has been updated. We now have damage and range. Let's run over. There'll be a problem, but that's cool. Problems are things we can fix. The problem is that our enemies aren't really doing much anymore. That's because we've broken them. They have an unarmed, but we're not really set up for unarmed in a very clever way. Hey, while I'm here, I'm just going to change damage on sword to, I don't know, 10, make it a bit more than it was, and give ourselves a mechanism for creating an unarmed weapon. Well, an unarmed weapon, it's not really a weapon, is it? But we'll create a scriptable object so that we can change things like the damage and if we do wish to override the current default animations and the range and so on. So, new folder within our weapons folder, create folder, we'll call this unarmed, and in unarmed, right-click, create weapons. We've got our contextual make new weapon scriptable object. This will be unarmed. Unarmed weapon damage. We'll make this, I don't know, 3 just to make sure it's a little bit different. 1 is fine. Weapon prefab, we don't have a weapon prefab and animator override. We don't want to override the animator, but what we do want to do is to jump over into our weapon class, and just to make sure that when we instantiate and when we're doing our override, that we're not getting into trouble if we have any null situations. So, what do I mean by that? Null situation, is that the terminology? We'll write in if weapon prefab does not equal null, then we want to instantiate. And I'm going to come back to weapon prefab in a moment. Not happy with that naming. Then, whoops, then we want to instantiate the weapon. If we have a weapon, is what we're saying here. If there is no weapon, then don't go ahead and try to create a weapon. Pretty easy, just protecting against that null scenario. Null scenario? I think that might be better. Okay, if animator override does not equal null, same deal. Wrap our statement in our curly braces. Hey presto. Okay, weapon prefab. I mentioned I'm not happy about that. So let's rename this from weapon prefab to, we'll just call this equipped prefab, which is really what we're saying here. If you don't have a prefab equipped, then don't try to instantiate that equipped prefab, and it may be a weapon or it might be something else. Just tidying up our terminology so it's really clear we're talking about what you have equipped here. Okay, we'll save that, and then a couple of things we'll need to tidy up. We need to find our player, make sure that our player still has what the player needs to have. On the player, does the player have a sword? Yes, the player does. Cool. And then our enemies, I'm going to give the enemies an unarmed weapon as we've created here. So let's go and find our enemies. Enemy. I'm going to go into the enemy prefab. And then over where we have weapon, I will click on the selector. This is in the fighter script. Weapon, we will provide that unarmed, which is excellent. And while we're here, we'll also give it a hand transform, because technically it's not a weapon, but you still are punching with your hand. So if we want to have any hit effects, we want to do that when we're punching. So scroll down, find right hand, and under right hand, click on that, back up to the enemy level, and now I can drag the right hand into the hand transform. There we go. Exit back out of enemy. Just click that, check that all our enemies do have that behavior. Yes, unarmed and right hand. Click on play. Now what we want to see when we run over there is the player has their big old sword, which the player doesn't. We've broken something there. Let's have a look and see what we've broken with the player's weapon. I think it might be because of my rename over here of equip prefab. So we'll click on our sword scriptable object. Find the sword in here. Yep, you can see equip prefab has disappeared. So click my selector and search for equip sword. So equip sword goes into equip prefab. Yeah, better naming there, I think. Click on play, make sure the player's got his sword. Oh, soon I'm going to have to implement the player's secret weapon. I'll tell you about that when we get to it. A little bit of suspense. What's the secret weapon? And they're punching as they should do, and he's got his sword as he should do. And let's just check that the player's damage, health is going down. Where is his health before he dies? Health is going down. Yep, it's going down as they punch him. Excellent. Okay, so now we've got an unarmed weapon. We could equip that to the player as well if we wanted. It's contained within our scriptable object, and we have gotten rid of our errors that we've had there before. So thanks for your patience with those errors. I know it's taken a while. Great stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, this is an exciting lecture because we can run over pickups like this, bloink, and give our player a weapon pickup, which we could do for any sort of weapon our heart desires. In the middle of the video, you'll see me make a big old mistake and then take ages to try to figure out what's going on. Maybe you'll figure it out before I do. That's just a little warning to see if you've got your thinking hats on, see if you can figure out what Rick does wrong before Rick does it wrong. Okay, let's jump in and get started. Okay, let's start by going through what we're doing in this video. In terms of picking up and equipping weapons, we need to expose equipping as a public method. We need to differentiate the concept of default weapon or starting weapon with that of current weapon so that we can be cycling through current weapon as we pick up our pickups. We need to create a weapon pickup, and we need to update the player's weapon in their hand using the pickup's weapon type. So first things first, let's go open up our fighter script. I'm going to give you a few questions. This is a little quiz, one of those pop quiz times. So the first question I've got for you is, where in our fighter class would we need to change from private to public a method that will equip our weapon? Okay, so scroll through the fighter class, have a look, see if you can figure out where that is. What part of this do we need to change to make public? Okay, so if you've gone through how to look at it, you'll probably see that spawn weapon, this is where we're creating the weapon. We need to change this name. It's no longer spawning weapon, is it? It's equipping weapon. The spawning's actually taken care of in the weapon class. So let's rename spawn weapon to equip weapon and change from private to public. That will allow us on our pickup class, which we'll create shortly, to call equip weapon. And when we're equipping the weapon, what do we need to do? What information do we need when something publicly calls equip weapon? We need to know the weapon type, so weapon, weapon. And let's scroll all the way up to the top of our class. So instead of weapon, we're going to have a default weapon as the very first weapon that the player starts with. Whoops, default weapon is null. And then when we're equipping weapon at start, we need to pass in what? We pass in default weapon. And now next we need a concept of what the current weapon is. So let's make a new variable, which will be of weapon type, current weapon. And again, we'll initialize that at null. Okay, we've taken care of what we do when we equip the weapon at start, when we first start the game. What do we need to do? What do we need to change here in equip weapon? What do we no longer need? What is no longer relevant? And what do we need to add in here for equip weapon? Well, we no longer need to protect against null, because there won't be situations, I believe, where we don't have any weapon for the player. We're going to have a weapon for sure. Now, we do need to add an extra line in here, just saying what? What is the weapon going to equal? The current weapon equals what? Equals weapon. The weapon that we've just passed in whenever we call this equip weapon. And now there's two other places in this script that need a little bit of an update. Can you figure out where they are? And a bit of a hint, Visual Studio is probably telling you where they are. So see if you can scroll around and figure out what else we need to update. Okay, just scrolling down, I can see weapon. We no longer have weapon, we have what? Current weapon. And similarly, just below here, we don't need weapon, we need current weapon, because we've updated that. Okay, just a little bit of a refactor there, trying to make it a little bit more interactive and a bit more interesting for you. I know refactors can sometimes be a little bit dull. Okay, here's another little pop quiz for you. See if you can figure out how to add a game object into our world that we can use as our weapon pickup. Okay, where do we start? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is create a pickup folder. Doesn't have to be the first place you start, but I'm going to start here, pickups folder. Okay, and then just in terms of organization, I'm going to right click, create empty. I'll call this pickups so that I can put all of my pickups in this one spot. And then underneath that, right click and create another empty. I'll call this I'll call it a sword pickup. Okie dokie. Got a sword pickup here. I'm going to prefab this sword pickup by dragging it down into my pickups folder. Double click on sword pickup. From within here, I want to actually put a sword in here. So let's scroll around. Where do we find our sword? Under prefabs, all the way down the bottom. Sword, drag that so it's underneath my sword pickup. So we now have that prefab in there that we're linking into our sword prefab. Excellent. I can't see it at the moment. I'm going to click F. Oh, that zoomed us in nicely. I think I'm going to want to make it bigger. So let me just for now make this, I don't know, 2, 2, and 2. Okay, I think I want to have my sword laying down, maybe stabbing out of the ground. No, I'll have it laying down. So I'm just going to change on my sword here. I'm going to rotate it so it's lying flat. We'll make it -90, blink. And then in our game, it's kind of disappeared because it's underground. That's fine. Looks a good size. Jump back out of our sword pickup prefab and move it around so it's in a spot where we can actually see it and manipulate it. It's pretty huge now. I'm just going to jump back in, change my size a little bit on the y-axis. I'm going to make 1.5. Okay, it makes it a little bit smaller. I think that looks okay for now. Now, while in sword pickup, what else do we need to have on here? Well, we need to have some sort of collision so we know to pick it up. I'm going to do a sphere collider, I think. Sphere collider. That looks like it's okay. Let's place it down the handle pivot. So I need to make it a little bit bigger, probably about yay big, and then just slide it around so it's in the middle of the sword. Okay, I think that's it. When I run over it, that is going to be good. Looking sharp as far as pickups go. Okay, what's the next thing we need to do with our pickup? Okay, we need to add some logic for our pickup. So while I'm in my sword prefab here, I'm going to add a component, and I will call this weapon pickup, making a new script. New script, create and add. And then while I remember, back over into assets, and I'll just drag that into the right location. Weapon pickup can go into, need to drill down into combat, I believe. Into combat. Okay, we're getting really close. Let's go ahead and open up our new weapon pickup that we've just created. Okay, and you know what? I think this is a good time for a challenge, actually. So let's have a challenge to create the weapon pickup logic. Here are the hints for you to use on trigger enter, as we do, to check that it is the player that is entering the collision and not, say, an enemy or something else. Call the equip weapon that we've just exposed and pass in the appropriate weapon. So make sure you create a field that we can pass in the weapon, and then to destroy the pickup game object. Okay, so there is your challenge to create a pickup. Give it your best shot, and I'll see you back here when you're done. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all this stuff in here, the start and update methods. And the first thing we want to do is namespace this. So I'm going to cut out the information I have here, and namespace, it will be rpg.combat. And within there, we'll paste what we just removed. Okay, weapon pickup, mono behavior, excellent. At the top of our class, I'm going to expose a field, serialized field. This will be weapon. We'll just call it weapon. We'll initialize that at null. And then, what do we want to do next? Well, we want to have our on trigger enter. So on trigger enter, collider, excellent. Just rearrange my curly braces, great. So with this other, we can find out whether it is the player or not. So if the other dot game object dot what dot tag equals print, what are these, talking quotation marks, there we go, capital P player, make sure it's a capital P or else it won't be happy with you, and make sure you have two equal signs, not just one. There we go. If it is the player that's colliding, then first of all we want to equip the weapon. What did we just create in here in fighter, where do we equip? Here it is, equip weapon, and passing in the weapon. So we will say other dot get component. What's the component? It's going to be the fighter component. And we're calling equip weapon, passing in what we're passing in this weapon that we have serialized. And then we want to destroy just simply this game object. So in other words, whatever this script is attached to. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go back over into our sword pickup. Our sword pickup should have on it the weapon pickup. Great. What sort of weapon do we want? Well, let's have the sword. There it is right there. Should have all the sword information. Excellent. And then we need to make sure, I always forget this step, is trigger is clicked on. That is pretty important when we're making a trigger. Okay, click on play. Have the player running around. Is the player starting with a weapon? No. Runs over the sword. Bloink. Nothing happens. Okay, let's investigate. This is excellent when nothing has happened. Okay, so I've paused the video and taken some time to figure out what the heck have I done wrong here, because when I run over my sword, it won't pick up. I've gone through and looked at my enemies, made sure they're all assigned to unarmed and they all have a weapon type, that's not causing a problem. Make sure that the player has the unarmed as the default weapon. Yep, the enemies have unarmed as default weapon. Great, that's not it. Have a look at my logic in here for weapon, for weapon pickup. This looks pretty good. If the player's running over it, I tested it by putting in a debug line in here, and that wasn't coming up, so I know that the issue is the collision moment isn't even happening. And then when we look at collision moment not even happening, what's important? Well, the sword needs to have a trigger. Yes, it does. What does the player need? The player needs a rigid body, and the player didn't have a rigid body. So I've gone into character, open up prefab, and just added a rigid body in here. Rigid body, and I've turned off use gravity because we don't need gravity at the moment. So obviously just click on add component and add a rigid body, which I now have, so that when I come back into the scene here, we've got took a while for me to figure that out. That was one of those. I went through every other thing before I thought about rigid body, and then bloink, there we go. Our player can now run over the sword. We'll just make sure that we haven't broken the enemies. I can still go over there and click on them, and yep, ba-ding, ba-ding, we can have our battle. Excellent, so we've created pickup. So well done in this lecture, and I'll see you in upcoming video. In this video, we're going to start the process of giving the player a bow and arrow and having him wield it in his left hand because our animation plays from the left hand. So let's jump in and make ourselves left-handed. Let's start by bringing in an asset pack. I've given you some weapons against this lecture. Game Dev TV weapons, just download that and unzip it and then drag in the asset pack into assets. That will give us our usual dialogue, and if I have restructured everything nicely, which I tried to do just a moment ago, yep, we'll have our Game Dev TV assets. For now, we're focusing on the simple bow, and we need to have the bow so that we can start our journey of making projectiles, which is going to be awesome. Now, let's have a look at the animations, and I'll show you why we need to have left-handed animations in our game. So, where are we? The animations by explosive, and then we have our two-handed bow, and then drill down into that, find the one that looks like the animation. If you don't see the preview, it might be hidden. I'm going to change the avatar to the Unity model, just center it a little bit here. And then when I click on play, I've got it slowed down, by the way. You can see that he's holding it in his left hand and shooting with his right hand, which is normal for a right-hander to do if you're shooting a bow and arrow. So let's give ourselves some functionality to be able to do that. I'm going to jump over into my script, into the fighter script. Let's see, combat, and then fighter, and I think weapon as well will be the two we'll be using yet again. So now fighter script, where we've got our hand transform, let's give ourselves a concept of two different hand transforms here, a left and a right. Where are all the places we're using hand transform in here? You can see we've just got it in here where we're equipping the weapon. Okay, so it's just in the one spot we're using it. So I'm going to rename this F2 and call this right hand transform. Okay, so that will have changed my other setting down below, and I will, I'll copy this, and we'll make ourselves a left-hand transform. So very clear, we can say where is the right and where is the left. Left-hand transform. Now, let's scroll down to where we do have our right-hand transform down here and see what's going on. So over in our weapon class, we're going to want to spawn, and we'll have to pass in the right and the left. So let's just give that functionality here, and then we'll go over into the spawn method, and create the place for us to put our arguments. But for now, we'll pass in the right-hand transform, comma, left-hand transform, and we'll get all sorts of errors here, most probably. Yep, save that up, jump over into our weapon script, where we have spawn. We're looking for the hand transform. We'll change this to right-hand transform, right-hand transform, comma, transform, and then our left hand transform. There we go. Actually, you know what? That's getting a little bit massive. So let's just say right hand and left hand in here, because we've already defined it as a transform. So I think we'll know what we mean when we just say right hand and left hand. Within weapon as well, let's give ourselves the ability to say whether the weapon is a right-hander or a left-hander. How do you think we would do this? What sort of variable would we need to define whether it's right hand or left hand? We're going to need a bool. So we will serialize field. This will be of type bool, and we'll call this, we'll say right-handed, because I think mostly it'll be defaulted to right-handed. We'll say is right-handed. Usually with a bool, we try to say is, so is it this, and then we can have a yay or nay, and we'll define this as true, or initialize this as true. Now we've got our red squiggly line in here. Can you figure out why that is? We were looking for just one hand transform. Now we're looking for two. We've got this notion of, is it right, yes or no, true or false? How do you think we can change our instantiate to use the right hand if we should be using it, or the left hand if we should be using it? I'm going to start off by defining a variable of type transform that I'll call hand transform. And then I'll have a little if statement in here. If is right-handed, then what do we want to do? I'm going to scrunch up my syntax here, not put in the curly braces, although I know it's often good habit to do that in case we have a second line. Then hand transform equals right hand that we've passed in. Now, else we will have hand transform equals what? Left hand, you guessed it. And there's even tighter ways we could write this, but for now I think that's really clear. We can see exactly what's going on. So hand transform, if we have our right-handed bool is true, then use the right hand. Otherwise, use the left hand. Great, I think that's pretty clear. Save that on up. Let's jump back over into Unity now and just have a look at our fighter. So jump into core, on player. So we have a right hand and we have a left hand, and we've probably broken our enemies as well. So let's just go and find the right hand on the player, so I'm going to jump inside the player prefab and scroll down, open up the right hand, and while I'm here I'm going to open up the left hand. Left hand's connected to the transform. Okay, there we go, we've got the right hand, the left, so just back up to player, find the fighter, drag on in left hand to the left hand transform, and obviously we put the right hand in the right hand transform. Okay, jump back out of player. I'm also going to go find my enemy. Let's find one of our enemies. Where are you, enemies? There's an enemy in there. Jump into the enemy prefab, doing the same thing here, finding the right hand, cool, and drag it over into the right hand transform, and then find the left hand. Where are you, left hand? And drag the left hand into the left hand transform. Okay, now let's do a little bit of a test to see this has worked. I'm going to find one of my weapons here. I'll find the, where are we, down here, weapon sword. The sword on our scriptable object I'm going to turn off is right-handed, and then our sword is on the ground as a pickup. So let's see what happens when we run over and pick up this sword. And it's in the left hand. And it's all arranged in a bit of a wonky way. So the way we've structured our code is saying each weapon is only going to be right hand or left hand. We're not going to say some characters are right-handed and some are left-handed. It's going to be based upon the weapon. So really, this left-handed functionality is for the bow and arrow, and we're not going to have different setup for right and left-handed swords at this point in time. I'm going to click right-handed back on. Excellent. So now we need to make ourselves a bow so we can put it in the left hand and have the player run around, look sensible. And this is going to be your challenge to create a bow. We've created weapons a couple of times now. So create the bow game object, create the bow scriptable object, create the bow animator override, and get the positioning correct for the left hand with the bow. So there's your challenge. Take that on. See you back here in a moment. Okay, weapons, right-click, create folder, call this bow, and within our bow I'm going to right-click, create a weapons, make new weapon. This will be a bow scriptable object. Within here, what's the animator override? That will be something we haven't created yet, so right-click, create animator override controller. This will be called bow override. I keep forgetting what I call this. What did I call this in sword? Sword override controller. Okay, bow. I'm going to call it bow animator override, because animator is the keyword here that's going to have me remember what's going on. I'm also going to change my sword to sword animator override. There we go. So a bit of a consistency. Back to bow animator override. Yep, that feels good. When I click on that, what's the animator controller? Well, it's going to be our character. And then in terms of the bottom animation here, the unarmed attack, instead of that, it's going to be the two-handed bow attack. Delightful. There we go. So now we have our bow. We can successfully select our bow animator override. The prefab, we haven't made our prefab yet. We'll get to that in a moment. Damage, I don't know, we'll make it 10. We'll play around with this a lot more later on. And range, that's an important one. We'll make it 5 for now, just so we've got it a bit further. And we switch off our right-handed. Okay, now we need to make ourselves a bow game object. Couple of ways we can do this. How shall I do it this time round? You know, I will do it similar to the way I did it last time, where I will go and find the character's left hand. Boop, boop, boop. Left hand just there, and I'll make a game object. So right-click, create empty. I'll call this bow. There we go. And then the bow I will drag down into my weapons, my bow weapons. Double-click on that to open up the prefab. Looking good so far. And then find my simple bow prefab. Drag the simple bow underneath the bow. Pay special attention to the transform. Looks like it's way off in Never Never Land. Reset that. You see, this is generally in the player's hand. Do we need to make it bigger? Might make it a little bit fatter on the Z-axis just so we can see it more easily. There we go. Bloink. That looks pretty good. Click on play so that we can mess around with the positioning. Okay, it looks not too bad. Just rotate him this way, rotate it that way, rotate it this way. I think this is going to be okay. Stop him bouncing around. He's got ants in his pants, as we would say in Australia. Maybe people say that everywhere. Is that a saying? Is that a saying where you're from? Ants in your pants? It means you're kind of bouncing around on the spot. That looks fine. Good enough for now, and we can finesse it later on. I can let you finesse it to your heart's content, but that looks like how one would hold it. Okay, so as we did before, click on the simple bow, and then find the transform, right-click, copy component, click out of play mode, Jump back into our bow prefab. Simple bow inside our bow, and then right click, paste component values, and that should be pretty good. Now when we jump back into the game, we'll go up to the character, so player, find the default weapon, change the default weapon to the bow. Oh, and sorry, he's also got the bow that I haven't deleted. So we delete the bow that he has in his hand, and then over onto our scriptable object to make sure that we tell him the equip prefab is going to be the bow. You know what? It shouldn't be called bow, should it? It should be called equipped bow. Sorry to everyone who's been yelling at the screen saying we called it equipped sword, Rick. So let's call it equipped bow. Excellent. So now in our scriptable object, we can change this to equipped bow. Excellent. Check on our player that we have the bow as a default weapon. Yes, I've switched that on. Now when we run around, we have a bow. Excellent. And make my screen a bit bigger here. We'll see what happens when we get in a spot to be able to shoot the guys. What animation? Yeah, it plays that animation. It looks a little bit wacky. We do need to adjust the bow a little bit, but for now it's pretty good. I'm going to change the scriptable object on the bow so the weapon range is 10, just to see how that goes, to make sure our weapon range is actually working as intended. Click on a dude. Yeah, there we go. Ba-dang, ba-doop. Okay, got a little bit of gangster sidewards bow action happening there. Okay, that is it for this lecture. We'll make ourselves a bow pickup in upcoming video, and also we'll resolve this whole shoot has no receiver. If you see that, don't worry about that. That is something that we will take care of in upcoming videos. Great stuff, and see you again soon. Hello again. In this video we're making a projectile fly at the player. We're just using a debug mechanism of just dragging in and saying the target is the player, and also just dropping a projectile in the world. We're not spawning it from the bow yet. We'll do that in upcoming videos, but now we can have an arrow, bam, shoot at the player, and then do some weird wiggly things because it's not destroying itself yet and not decreasing health, but this will be the start of our arrow functionality. Let's jump in and get started. Let's start first by grabbing our arrow asset that we're going to use for our projectile. I've given you this as a download for this lecture. Grab simple arrow, drag it on in. That should be going to Game Dev TV Assets, import. You can see simple arrow appears there. G'day, simple arrow, how you doing? Doing well, thanks, Rick. Okay, first sign of insanity, talking to yourself, but we have our arrow that we can use for our creating our game object. So I'm going to jump over into Game, scroll down a little bit here, make myself a new folder, so create folder, projectiles. Now scene, I'm going to make a new game object, create empty, we will call this arrow projectile. Excellent. Drag that down to make it a prefab into my projectiles folder, open up the arrow projectile, and let's see, where is the arrow we just brought in? There's the prefab, the simple arrow prefab, drag that under arrow projectile, and we have ourselves a simple arrow. Now it's pointing up in the arrow. I think I want to, well, first of all, let's learn our lesson by resetting the transform, and I can see it in my scene if I zoom in. Side note, I'm going to change my camera in a minute when we get back into the scene, but I want to have my arrow starting lying down, so we'll do it at a -90, I think. There we go. So it's just generally laying flat in the scene. Okay, we have our projectile. Let's scroll down to our scripts folder, find combat, right click, create a new C# script. I'll call this projectile. Excellent. And then click on arrow projectile again, drag over our projectile script so that sits there as a component on the prefab. Good, looking pretty sharp. Now, there's the arrow in our scene. Welcome arrow. And I mentioned camera a second ago. I haven't been able to put my finger on it, my friends, but finally I have. It's so hard to show you what's going on with my character because we're so zoomed out. So it might not be best when we finally play the game, but I'm going to turn my camera distance down to, say, 11, maybe even 10. Okay, so that when I'm demonstrating to you what's going on in the build and in the game while we're teaching, you can actually see it. We don't have to squint at our screens to see that there is an arrow there after all. Okay, so how are we going to go about making our arrow move? Well, you might know the answer already, but I'll just recap. First of all, we have two simple steps that we need to do on each frame in update. The first step is to make the projectile look at the target, so it's heading in the correct direction, and then we move it in the forward direction. So if it's forward is this way, because it's pointing at the target, in this case the player, and it's going to move in that particular direction each frame. And this is going to be the structure of the challenge I have for you. Now that we have our projectile script sitting on our projectile, I would like for you to move the arrow projectile. So use transform.lookAt to look at the target. Who is the target? Well, you can make the target whoever you like. I suggest you make it the player for the moment. And then to use transform.translate to move to the target. And remember a couple of things here. Don't forget to use time.delta so that we are frame rate independent. And to expose a variable so that we can tune the speed, mostly for our play testing, so we can have the arrow going super slowly so that we can see that it actually works. So there's your challenge. Give it your best shot, and I'll see you back here when you're done. Okay, over into our projectile script. Fire that up. Have a look at what's going on here. I think I'm going to get rid of start because I don't need that, but we will keep update and expose a couple of variables at the top. Serialize field. And this I'm going to make a target, so the target needs a transform, and I'll just call this target. We've done this a few times throughout our code already. I'm going to initialize that at null, just so we know that there is none at the start, and the compiler doesn't get too cranky with us if we forget to put something in. Then we need a second serialized field. This will be for our speed of the projectile. I'll make this a float, and we'll call it speed, and we'll initialize that at 1. Now, within update, we are going to do a couple of things in here. First of all, I'm just going to protect against null so that if we don't have a target, we don't get ourselves into a situation. If target equals null, we simply return. Okay, protect against null. Now, we want to say transform.lookAt, as I showed you in the challenge, and we're going to look at the target.position. And second, we are going to use the second thing I told you, transform.translate. And here I'm going to use vector3.forward. And if you're not familiar with vector3.forward, you can have a look at the Unity documentation for that. Essentially, manipulate a game object's position on the z-axis of the transform in world space. So move it forward on the z-axis is the description that we've got here for vector3 forward. And then I'm going to multiply that. Remember, this is per frame by speed, and then multiply it per frame by time.delta time. Okay, how'd you go with that? Did that challenge make sense? Maybe the vector3 forward threw you a little bit, or maybe you did it a slightly different way, which is totally cool. One of the important things is to get the job done and not get hung up on doing it exactly the way Sam and I do. If we do it slightly differently, that is fine. So let's see if this works now. Jump back over into our game. We've got our arrow projectile that I've dropped into the world. It currently has no target, so we'll set the target to be player, boink, and speed of 1. Should be nice and slow. My camera's zoomed in, so you should see me as I run around. Let's see if it actually chases me. Okay, it's going backwards for a start, so that's something which is noteworthy. We rotated it the wrong way, but it's moving. Let's go back into my prefab that I thought I was so cleverly rotating, but I was not very cleverly rotating, was I? Arrow projectile. You can see from our vector3 forward, it was saying what in terms of the blue, let's see, what in terms of the blue, it's saying the blue axis of transform in world space. So basically we just got that back to front. I had it correct on the right axis, but pointing the wrong way. So let's click on our simple arrow. So instead of minus 90, we want to do that, well, probably plus 90. Okay, see how that goes. Save this up, back over into our game. Click on play. We'll see which way our arrow is pointing this time. Okay, looks like it's pointing towards us. Success. Once it's shot, it's going to go very fast at us. It's going to look, I think, pretty good. Just grab the arrow projectile, move it away a little bit over to there. See what happens if we change the speed to, say, we'll make it 8, and then click on play just to make sure it's behaving like an arrow should. And bam, yes, it does. It shoots straight at us. Now, it's shooting straight at our feet. Why is that? Well, if you click on the player, you can see that the player's axis here, its point of interest, its pivot, is at the feet. So that is the transform information that's being given to our arrow. It's looking at our feet. So let's resolve that by saying we want you to look at where, probably in the middle of the player, you know, right in the chest. So it's good kind of, what's that, critical mass? No, it's solid mass, central mass, I think that's the terminology. So we want to aim for the guts, basically. So how are we going to do that? Let's jump back over into our script here. And so in our update, instead of target position, let's return, we need to get the position we're going for, get the location. So I'll create a new method called getAimLocation. We'll jump down below and create this. It'll be private. Now we need to return a vector 3 because we need a particular point in space that we're aiming at. So it'll be a vector 3, and this will be called getAimLocation. What is in here? First of all, we want to use what to know how to attack a particular entity, the player, for example. So the player, I've clicked on here already, has a capsule collider, and we know the capsule collider is most likely going to be the same height as the player or the enemy or whatever entity it's on. So we use the capsule collider. We'll make ourselves a new variable, which will be of type capsule collider, that we'll call target, not target, target capsule. I think that's spelled right. And that's going to equal target.getComponent. Which component we're looking for? It's the capsule collider. And then once we have that capsule collider, we need to return our vector 3. So let's return the target.position, and we're going to add to this the height, but I'm going to halve the height. So it'll be the height of the capsule collider divided by 2. So we get in the middle here. I'm going to use a little bit of shorthand again. Use vector3.up. And if you want to know what vector3.up is, I've given you a link to this as well. It's just a shorthand way of saying vector 3, 0, which is on the x, 1, which is on the y, and 0, which is on the z. So basically, it's giving us an upwards of 1, a y value of 1. We write it vector3.up as shorthand. And we'll multiply this by the target capsule.height divided by 2, because we want to get it roughly in the middle. You can make it a little bit higher or a little bit lower if you wish. So this is adding just on the y-axis. This is why we're plussing a vector 3, so it's adding on the y-axis. We're not adding 1, we're adding whatever 1 times the capsule height is divided by 2. So let's just quickly look at this. I know some people will be asking, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. So we click on the player, we see the height is 1.79. We're getting half of that value because we're dividing it by 2, and we're adding that to the y value of the target's vector 3 that we're interested in using as our aim location. And lastly, to make sure we don't have any issues if the target doesn't have a capsule collider, let's protect against that. If target capsule equals null, then we'll just return the position, because we might not know the capsule collider. We don't want that to break the whole projectile. We'll just return the target.position as we did before. If it does have a capsule collider, then we're going to return target.position plus this offset to increase it based upon the capsule collider's height. Okay, now let's save that, jump back over into Unity. We've got our projectile here. I'm just going to turn the speed of the projectile down again so we can see it in slow motion. Make sure we know exactly where it's going. Put it down to 3. Click on play. And we'll see where the arrow... Bam! Right in the guts. Okay, pretty happy with that. It's not really intended to be a homing missile, but you could make it that if that was your desire. But we have a projectile that we can give to our archers so that they can shoot at us, which we'll be doing in upcoming videos, actually launching our projectile, blink, so we can shoot at each other. Okay, great work, and I'll see you again soon. In this video, we're going to be shooting at our enemies. Look at this. We've got a bow and arrow, and it's shooting out projectiles. I've tuned them pretty slow so that we can see them on screen, but we have started our journey of launching projectiles. Let's jump in and get started. Let's start with a high-level breakdown of what we're trying to do in this video. These are the main steps to launching the projectile. In our fighter script, we need to launch the projectile. So this is where we actively launch it. We need to pass in the target from fighter, because fighter knows who the target is. Within our weapon script, we need to instantiate the projectile game object to bring it to life. And then in our projectile script, we need to set the projectile's target based upon the health component that it received from the fighter. There's a few more bits and pieces we need to do, but I just want to give you a view that we have to jump into each of these scripts and hook it all together. So let's open up our fighter, weapon, and projectile scripts. I'm going to start in projectile, kind of do the easy thing first, which is to make sure that we're using the health for our target rather than using the target transform as a serialized field. So I'm going to change the type of target from transform to health. I'm going to remove the serialized field, boom, boom, health, and I'm just going to grab it and stick it down below. And now we're getting the squiggly line. That's because we're not using the right namespace. Control period. using RPG core. Excellent. We scroll down here, you can see target.position is no longer valid because we've changed from type transform to type health, which means we need to have target.transform.position. And as with the line below, target.transform.position. Now the one other thing I'll do in projectile while I'm here is make a public method that allows us to, from elsewhere, to say what the target is, to set targets. So, new line, public void, this we will call set target. And we want to pass in the target of type health. So, health target. And then what do we want to do with that? Well, we need to say this target that our projectile knows, once it's instantiated, it knows, aha, this is my target. We need to be assigning the target that's been passed in into the target that is the instance variable. So, pretty easy, we just say this, referring to this game object, this instance target, equals target, which is referring to the target that was just passed in. Let's go over to our weapon class now and give the weapon knowledge that there is potentially, that it could potentially be a projectile. And that's pretty simple. We'll just add a new serialized field that will be of type projectile, and we will call this projectile. And we'll initialize that at null. So some weapons will have a projectile, and some weapons won't have a projectile. In other words, a bow and arrow versus a sword. And now we need to give our other classes a mechanism for knowing, do I have a projectile or not? So we'll make a simple getter method down underneath spawn. Let's make a new method. It will be public, and it needs to return a bool, and we'll call this has projectile. And it's simply going to return projectile is not equal to null. Okay, so that's going to give us a bool that allows us to say, do we have a projectile equipped, yes or no, that we can be calling from fighter to know whether we should be launching a projectile or we should be hitting with our hand weapon. And while we're here, we may as well instantiate our projectile, so actually create the game object. So another public method, public void launch projectile, and we need to be passing in, again, the right hand and left hand, so we know what those are, and also the health for the target. So the target, which will be of type health. So similar to our spawn, but this is going to be for projectile, not just for weapons. So launch projectile, transform right hand, comma, transform and left hand. And also we want to know the target, which will be of type health. So when launch projectile is called, what do we want to have happen? Well, we want to instantiate our projectile. So we'll create this as a new variable, type projectile. We'll call this projectile instance. And then we instantiate, hopefully this fits on my line here, projectile, and then where? Well, we need to get the transform, and we've got this information in here. You know what? It's time for us to break this out. Remember, we created this a couple of videos ago so that we have our mechanism for saying, are you in the right hand or are you in the left hand? We want to do that here as well, but we don't want to put all that code in. So we'll just refactor this, grab those three lines there, our transform and then our if and else. We will hit control and period, extract method, that we will rename, our new method will rename get transform. Okay, right hand, left hand, great, that's all contained in there. So back down to our launching of projectile. So the projectile is the what, the where is going to be get transform, and we need to pass in, when we're calling our launch projectile, we're providing the right hand and left hand information. So let's pass that in, right hand, comma, left hand, dot position. Sorry, this is getting quite massive across our screen here, comma, and this is where we do the rotation, which is just simply quaternion dot identity, and then semicolon. Okay, so that's quite a massive line there. Let me just scroll across it so you can see it. Projectile instance equals instantiate projectile, which is the what, get transform right hand, left hand, which is the where dot position, and then quaternion identity, which is the rotation of our instantiation. And just back to the red squiggly line on health, that looks like we need to be control period using RPG core, because that's in a different namespace. So that's added that RPG core up at the very top. Okay, and now while we're here in launching projectile, we need to say where's it going to. So if you remember, within projectile, we've created set target, which is looking for target that has a health component on it, and that's setting it as the target for this projectile. So within weapon, when we instantiate, this is the point where we want to say, go get him, here's your target. So that's simply a case of typing projectile instance dot set target, and then what do we pass in? Oh, we pass in target. So I know I'm working backwards here, but it's one of those things where you can work backwards or forward. It's a little bit of a web where it's all linked together. So launch projectile, we're going to get into that in a second. We're actually going to launch it, but I wanted to create the functionality in projectile first where it knows how to set the target, and then when we jump into weapon, the weapon is going to call set target and pass in the target, and when we call launch projectile, we need to be passing in the target and the different hand options for the position of the left hand and the right hand. So before we bring it all together in Fighter, I want to show you one thing on our animation. Now this is particular to the animation set that we have. We've seen this before on the attack animations. If I go and find animations by explosive, two-handed bow, open this up, click on the bow attack. I need to go window and animation, animation, find this here. You can see that we have our animation event. In this instance, it's been labeled as shoot. And unfortunately, we don't have access to change this because we don't have the animator on our team. This is an asset pack, so we need to deal with the fact that it's called shoot, whereas when we were working with our other weapons, our melee weapons, it is called, whoop, that's not what I want to do, it is called, where's my window gone? It is called hit. So it's hit with melee and shoot. We don't want to be trying to figure out, is it hit, is it shoot? So what we're going to do is just wrap shoot within hit. And the way we'll do that is we'll find our animation event way down. This is in fighter.cs. You can see we've given a little note here. Hit, this is out of our control. That's why it's a little bit clunky. Right underneath that, we are going to have a new method, which we will have void shoot. That's the method that is sitting on our animation as an animation event. What happens when we call shoot? What do you think we do here? Well, we simply just call hit. So this is a way for us just to have all this code in one place and not having to try to figure out all the different things. Each time another animation event is named differently, we can just point it all towards hit, if that is relevant. So to wrap all this together, I want to give this to you as a challenge. No slide on this one, but the challenge is a verbal one. It's contained within hit. So within here, we need to give a mechanism that says, if the current weapon has a projectile, then launch the projectile and pass in the information that it needs, particularly the target. Otherwise, if there is no projectile, then just call get damage and do what you do when you've just got a sword, etc. So, see if you can figure that out. Take on that challenge now to put in our mechanism to shoot or to not shoot. Okay, I know it's a little bit trickier when I don't have a slide, but I like to try these things out. Keep you on your toes. Sometimes it's very verbal, sometimes it's very visual. This one we are going to implement underneath our, if the target is null, we'll leave that there. We'll start by saying if current weapon, remember we've defined that in our fighter we have a current weapon, dot has projectile. We've created that as a method to say, do I have a projectile, returnable, yay or nay, true or false. If we do have a projectile, if it's true, then current weapon dot, what are we going to do here? Well, we need to launch the projectile. Launch projectile, we have to pass in, what's it looking for? Transform right hand, transform left hand, and the target. So we know that we have a right hand transform. We know that we have a left hand transform, comma, target. So we're going to launch, otherwise, else, what are we going to do? Well, we put in our line from below, target take damage, current weapon, boop, boop, boop. There we go. Current weapon, get damage, should be the same as it was before. Tidy up our lines a little bit. What have I done wrong here? It's got a squirrely line. Oh, I forgot a semicolon, of course. My apologies for that. Save everything up, and this is all looking pretty sharp. Okay, so that was a ton of code. Hopefully you followed along there. Let's jump back over into Unity, see what we've got. We will give the player a bow. Where is the player here? Default weapon, bow. Great, let's go have a look at the bow, make sure it's doing what it needs to be doing. Scroll down, game, weapons, bow. There's the bow. Projectile, we need to give it a projectile. The projectile is going to be in our projectiles folder. Arrow projectile, drag that over in. So now we have an arrow projectile. Okay, and we've still got our arrow in the seam. We don't need it anymore. It's not going to know what to do. Our arrow projectile, excellent. Going to jump into this prefab, change the speed to, we'll make it 6 for now so we can see it going through the air, hopefully. Jump on back, click on play. Okay, got our big old bow. About to here, click on an enemy and bam! Okay, it's going pretty slow, but it looks, I reckon, pretty epic and awesome. This is projectiles. You can speed it up to your heart's content to make faster arrows. We're going to be able to add trails on the back of it. We'll be able to substitute, instead of bows and arrows, we're going to have fireballs. But this is the start of it. We can have the enemy shooting at us. Super pumped, super excited that we now have shooting of projectiles in our game. In upcoming videos, we'll need to destroy the arrows. We'll need to decrease the health of the person you clunk into, and we'll add all of that sparkle as well. So great work. Thanks for your patience. I know this was a big video, and I'll see you in an upcoming lecture. Hello and welcome back, my friend. In this video we're going to be adding damage so that when we shoot our enemies, boom, it does more than just kind of jiggle around and sit there. We'll be destroying the arrow, we'll be doing damage, we'll be hurting our enemies. Just a reminder, we haven't implemented a bunch of stuff yet. Like, we haven't implemented the weapons within the saving system, so if you try to go to a different scene with a weapon, it's not going to continue. So still lots for us to do, but we're making fantastic progress. And the way we're going to structure this is, here's my dude shooting his arrow. We're going to have the damage amount being provided by the weapon, in this case the bow, and then it's calculated when it's launched. So when the projectile is launched and instantiated and pushed off towards the enemy, we're going to say at that point, the amount of damage you will do is, for example, 10. And then the damage is actually dealt when the arrow collides with the enemy or with the target. And we've done it this way so that we can have all of our weapons are responsible for the damage. That a sword is responsible for damage, and we can have our scriptable objects say the sword is, say, 10 damage, and the bow is, say, 10 damage. If you want to have a bow plus 5, it might be 15 damage. Rather than having to mess around with putting the damage onto the arrow, and to say, well, this bow needs to shoot that particular arrow, and it's a better bow, so let's shoot a better arrow. We'll just put all of the damage calculation onto the bow. But, side note, if you wanted to yourself in your game make a flaming arrow, then a flaming arrow could add more damage to whatever the bow is passing on. So there is the structure there if you want to do that within your game, but we're having the weapon be the ultimate authority for the damage. So let's fire up our projectile class. We need to give ourselves a notion of damage. I'm just going to remove that line before health and create a new float variable which I will call damage, and this will be 0 because it's not providing any damage at this point for our game. We want to be passing the damage in from our weapon when we call, what are we going to call in here? When we call set target. So let us find set target, health target. In addition to that, so comma, we also want an argument of float, so type float, which we will call damage. So in other words, when you call set target, you need to tell us the damage as well. And as we did before, let us set the damage that will be on the projectile once it's instantiated. This dot damage equals the damage that we've just passed in from calling set target. Okay, we'll save that. Now over to weapon. Find our set target. For me, it's on line 45, so it's within launch projectile. And we're passing in target, comma. Now, if memory serves, I scroll up. Weapon damage is what we've called it here. It's not just damage. Could probably be just damage, but it's called weapon damage at this point. So we will pass in weapon damage. Now, back over to projectile. What we need to do within here, I'm just going to put it down the bottom, is we need a mechanism for saying what happens when me, the projectile, the arrow in our case, collides with something. So what happens when I crash into an enemy? That's going to be the challenge for you. So apply damage from projectile. First of all, add on trigger enter to the projectile, just in the place that I started writing down here. And check that we collided with our target. So do a check to see, is this the target we collided with? If not, we want to return. And just a hint, remember that the target is of type health, so we can use that when we're doing our comparison. And then we call take damage, passing in the relevant things, hint, hint. And after that, we destroy the projectile so that it's not sitting around in the scene. And just a reminder, if you look at this and you're like, I'm not sure what to do, and you want to follow along with me, that's totally cool. But any moment you think, oh, I know that particular part of this, pause the video and do that particular part of the challenge so that you're practicing and you're flexing those muscles. Even if you can't do the whole challenge, doing part of the challenge is totally okay. So do your best to take on the challenge, and then we'll go through it together in a moment. Rightio, so on trigger enter to start what we're doing here, and you can see it's added collider other as information that we're going to be accessing. So we will start with if. We want to be looking at our other object in here. So if other dot get component. I was going to ask you, what component should we get? But I've kind of given you the answer, haven't I? Get component health is not equal to what? Here's a chance to, little mini challenge if you didn't do the challenge yourself. If it's not equal to target, then we return. We get the heck out of here. Why does this work? Well, target is of type health. So when we are looking at our other, the thing that we've collided with, getting the health component, and comparing it to target, which is of type health, we can do a direct comparison between the two and say, are they the same? If they're not, then return. Next line, we want our target to be taking damage, so target.take damage. And how much damage should we be doing? Well, damage. And that is going to be our instance damage. Up the very top, damage that starts off at 0, but then we pass in the amount of damage when we create this projectile and send it on its way. And then finally, destroy. And if you didn't do any of the challenge, here's the easy one that you can do. What do we destroy? We destroy game object. So in other words, destroy me, the arrow that has been shot. Okay, we'll save that. Back over into Unity. One more step that I didn't mention, but let's do this together, is to find our projectiles, jump into the arrow projectile, and what do we need to add to the arrow projectile? We need to add a collider. Okay, and oh, you know what? Sam was mentioning I had a wonky arrow. He said, Rick, you've got a bent arrow, and I thought he was just being a little bit crude just between you and me, but now I see what you meant, Sam. Okay, I do have a wonky arrow in here, and it's probably because I've got this weird rotation, so it should be negative 270. No idea why it is not. My apologies if you've been yelling at Rick's wonky arrow on the screen. Now I'm going to go back up to the parent level on arrow projectile, add component, box collider, and it comes in pretty massive, so we'll make it a bit more tightly fitting onto the arrow. So just changing the size and change the positioning a little bit. I'd like to have a little bit of the arrow poking out at the end so that the arrow pierces the heart of our foes a little bit before we trigger all of the damage and having it destroy. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. It's a reasonably fat kind of collider, but that's good. Make sure we won't miss. Give ourselves a bit of an advantage. Although the enemies are shooting the same arrow, so I guess they get an advantage as well. Now, let's see. The player needs to be holding the bow. Yes, default weapon, I have the bow equipped. The bow, let's have a look at that. Make sure we've got that covered. Bow, scriptable object, weapon damage 10, so that's what we'll be doing each time we shoot. Yes, and then the weapon range 10, I'll leave that as is, so I'm close enough to see. And you know what, just to be a little bit crazy, I'm going to give one of my enemies a bow as well. Crazy, Rick. Okay, which enemy do we want to look for? Enemy, boop, boop, boop. Enemy, this guy at the front. What number are you? Enemy 7 for me. And default weapon, we will give you a bow. Okay, he's not going to behave as we expect just yet, because we haven't implemented all of his logic. We haven't given him a different kind of chase radius and all that kind of stuff for the bow, but for now it's not too bad. Run over here, we'll shoot this dude. This dude is enemy 5 for me. We'll look at his health. At the moment it's 40. I just remembered something that I did wrong again. We'll fix that in a moment. First I'll show you the problem is happening here. First of all, it's too slow. We need to speed that up. But health's not going down. The arrow's not going away. What has Rick done? I did this deliberately so that you could learn the lesson of the stupid mistake that I make over and over. Actually, that's a lie. I just forgot yet again. I forgot to do what? I forgot to click on my projectile, on my box collider, is trigger. I need a little note. I need a tattoo on my inside of my eyelids. Always click is trigger, Rick. Else you will have drama. Okay, and while we're on arrow projectile, change the speed to 10 so it's not quite so slow motion. Back over into our game. Well done if you saw that when I was doing it and you're like, Rick, you've missed is trigger. And you clicked on is trigger because you know these things. Oh, wise one. And bounce. And then, yes, looks like it's disappearing. The arrow, his health is going down. He's gone. This guy, can he shoot at me? Yes, he can. But problem with him is when I walk over here, he's like, nope, not chasing you anymore. So we would need to play around with his chase radius. It's probably just some tuning we can do for him to make him more clever. But you can see we've got a general issue with our enemies. They need to chase you when you're shooting them. They can't just stand there and be like, yep, nothing to see. But we've got our arrows, and we're shooting, and we're doing damage, and the arrows are disappearing. So this is huge progress, super excited. This is making our game feel, you know what, feel pretty cool, I reckon. So great work in this video, and I'll see you again real soon. Welcome again, my friend. In this video, we're going to make an archer. We're going to shoot arrows, and those arrows are going to have spiffy trails coming out the back of them to make them really easy to see on our screen. So let's jump in and get started. Okay, just to recap where we are now, this is our arrow. We shoot, bow, it's pretty bland, not very exciting. So let's resolve that. The first thing I'm going to do is, you know what, I need to get my speed of my arrow how I want it. So I'm going to go into my arrow projectile prefab and turn the speed. I think I'm going to turn it up to 20. And then just check that this is good, because when we're creating a trail to come flying off our arrow, we want to know that we've got our speed settled in a way we're happy with. So, boom. Yeah, it feels like a good, I can see it flying across the screen. It feels pretty quick. I like it. Okay, so I'm going to have my arrow speed, my projectile speed at 20. Now, within my arrow, give myself a bit of space here, double click on simple arrow. Okay, so within here we've got our arrow, we've got our collision box. I'm going to add as a new child under arrow projectile, right click and go into effects, and we have something here called trail. Okay, so we have our trail. First thing I'm going to do is turn down the time, because this is like a particle system. This is how long things will be emitted for on our trail. Before I show you exactly what's going on the trail, we'll turn this down to say 0.2. See how that looks. Now if I grab the handle, this is selected on trail, so I grab my selection handle here, move it right and left, you can see as I move along there's a trail that comes flying along behind. It doesn't look very arrowy at the moment, so what we want to do is decrease the width of it. It's too big at the moment, so the width at the moment you can see here in our selection is 1. We can change the curve on it. I'm going to have this starting point down at say 0.3. Now when I move it around, okay, still pretty big, but that's okay, because I want to have the middle of my trail a bit fatter. So on our curve graph here, I'm going to double click to make a new point in the middle, and then double click to make a new point down at the end. Drag the first point down to around about 0.1, and drag the middle point down a little bit, and drag the end point all the way down to the end. See how that looks when I slide it along. So let's simulate how the arrow would go, like, bow, as we shoot along the screen. Okay, that's looking okay, I think. I want to make sure that it's back in the 0 point on my Z-axis, or wherever it is that I want the trail to be appearing. If I want the trail to be at the back of the arrow, you might want to have it a little bit forward, so you can see the front, the shaft of the arrow. Maybe the trail is coming out over the feathers, however you want to do that. But now when we go back into the game and click on play, let's see if this has worked. Run over to my enemies. I might move an enemy so I don't have to run so far. And click, shoot, and boom! You can see this trail's coming out the back of my arrow, which is really cool. And you can tune it. At the moment, you can see I've got it kind of narrow and then a little bit fat in the middle. You can tune it to your heart's content, and you can make it a little bit shorter or a little bit longer. And we change that by decreasing or increasing the time. Oh, just while I'm here, I don't think we need to receive shadows, so we'll click that off. Doesn't really matter, but we'll click it off just so we're not putting a bit more strain on the system. Next thing I'm going to do in this lecture is make ourselves an archer, and then we're going to make ourselves a different variant of the arrow, so that the archer he's shooting a different arrow that we're shooting at him, just to give a little bit of spice to the game, and it gives us a chance to do a little bit more with prefab variant. So we'll scroll down to the game folder, find characters, open that up. Looks like some of these things aren't in their folders. Tisk, was that me or Sam? Probably Sam. He tends to do these things, doesn't he? Okay, drag them into their folders. The truth is, it's me, and we all know it. I might make we'll leave characters where it is. Okay, so within enemies, this is our enemy prefab. We know what our enemy prefab looks like. Just drop it in there to show you again. What I'm going to do is right-click and find, where are we? Up in create, and we will create a prefab variant. So we go character, then we go enemy, and we have this enemy variant which I will call archer. Okay, so just to be clear, archer is a prefab variant of enemy. So let's open up our archer, have a look at the archer. I'll do two main things in here. One, we'll give the archer a different color, just so we can distinguish it from the other enemies. So where are we there? We're looking in our Cinti assets. Let's see, Cinti assets. Where are you? There we go. Cinti, looking for materials. And I think I will make this guy black. No, I'll make it red. You can change whatever you want to your heart's content. And then the other thing we're going to do, obviously, is to do what? To give the archer a bow. Okay, now the archer has a bow. Cool. Now, back over into the game. Let us drop in one of these new awesome archers into our world. Standing here front and center so we can have a little battle with the archer. Okay, cool. He's got a bow. We've got a bow. Let's just check that all the things work properly. Run, 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 run. And is he going to shoot me? Boom! Yeah, and you can see his trail happening. Bit of a problem. When I stand here, he's like, oh, I guess I shouldn't shoot anymore. But, haha, we can shoot you, and you can't shoot us. That is pretty cool for about 2 seconds, but the player would be, I think, get pretty bored with that. So, there are a few things here I want to give you as a challenge to tighten up this whole archery experience. Basically, make our archer more rad. So, to create two projectile variants. So we just created a variant of an enemy. I want to have a base projectile and have two variants of that. For me, I'm going to make one of them red and one of them blue. So if you want to figure out how to make your trails red and blue, you can. You can do other sorts of variants if you want. We've got just a white trail on our arrows at the moment. I'm going to make one red and one blue. And then to create a second bow scriptable object, and to give the enemy archer one of the bows and the player the other bow. Obviously, one bow is going to have one of your projectiles associated with it, and the other bow is going to have the other one. And then finally, to tune the enemy archer's shooting behavior, so he's a little bit cleverer about how he behaves when he's got his bow and arrow and shooting at us. So there is your challenge. Take that on and see you back here when you are done. Okay, first step is I'll find my projectiles. We've got our arrow projectile. I'm going to right-click, create prefab variant. I will call this arrow projectile red, and then same thing again on arrow projectile, right click, create prefab variant, and I will call this arrow projectile blue. Let's double click on one of these. I'll start with blue. What do I mean by blue? Well, we'll find our trail, and you can see here color. I'm going to have my color go from the first point. So I double click on the little what's this, doodad. I think that's technically a doodad down the bottom there, and we'll make it bluish in color and just move it a little bit long so it stays blue, 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 and then fades away into white. I think it's going to look neat. And speaking of fade, the top one, I'll double click on this, or single click on that, sorry, and make it a little bit more transparent. So it's going from a solid to more of a see-through trail down the back of the arrow. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'll go over and do similar on the red arrow. Double click on that into the trail. Okay, change the first part. Oop, click on that. Double click on that. Make it more of a red color. And then move it along a little bit. And then give a little bit of transparency up at the top. Okay, cool. So now we have a red projectile and a blue projectile. They're exactly the same except for their color trail. Now over into weapons, we've got bow. I'm going to rename this first scriptable object to bow with blue projectile. Bow, blue projectile, and then I'm going to control D to duplicate, and bow red projectile. Okay, and then on the blue projectile, clicking on that, we can go and find where our projectiles, drag in blue projectile. And then on our bow red projectile, we will drag in our red arrow. There we go. Now we need to go back to our player, and the player's default weapon is blue projectile, so bow with blue projectile, cool. That's the one that we'd renamed. Jump over to our archer. Where are you, Archer? Boo, boo, boo. Great TV show, Archer. Have you watched that show? One of my favorites. Characters, enemies, Archer. Double click on Archer to get into the prefab. We don't want the blue. We want to change that to be the red. Bow, red projectile. Awesome. Okay. Now let's see what happens here when we run up to the enemy. He shoots at us. Bam, that's a red projectile. We shoot at him. Boop, it's a blue projectile. Yes, the battle of good and evil, a song of ice and fire, if you will. Fantastic. Okay, and then the other thing we were going to do was make our archer a little bit cleverer with how he behaves. Let's have a look in the archer prefab. One thing we want to do, where are we looking here? The AI controller chase distance. I'm going to put that really high. I'm going to put it, say, 25. No, that's probably a bit too much. 20, which says chase distance. If he had a weapon, he'd run towards us, get to the point where his weapon range says you can now attack, and then he would attack. If we put a massive chase distance, and we also have the same weapon distance, then he's not going to actually run. It'll just be he starts shooting, because the moment he starts, his chase AI says, yes, chase, that will be, yes, start shooting. So he's now at 20, which is cool. We need to go and find the bow that he's wielding, so bow with the red projectile, and change the weapon range there to 20. Okay, why didn't I call it enemy bow and player bow? Well, we might want to give the player the red bow at some point, so I wanted to keep it specific to the weapon as opposed to specific to the use, because the use itself might change, whereas the color is not going to change, or the the structure of the weapon itself. Okay, so now he's shooting at us. Run all the way back here. Oh boy. Yeah, can I shoot at him? Who's got the bigger range? It'd be cool if the enemy has a slightly bigger range. That way we can't just sit there and pick him off. But now we can have this epic battle. The trails look a little bit hokey. They're a little bit overdone, but I like that I can see them on the screen now. I might consider making the trail a little bit shorter. Let's just do that now so I can show to you that when we change the trail, the arrow projectile, that's going to change both of our prefab variants. So the trail, just going to pop this down to 0.15, I think there, just so it's not quite so massive on the screen. Now when I go to shoot at the enemy, we both should have a slightly shorter trail. Yeah, looks pretty consistent, I think. Shoot that guy over there. Okay, excellent. So I think that's cool. I like it. And the homing missile, it's a little bit weird to have the homing missile. I really personally love it, to be honest, but you could add a little bit of logic so that you can dodge the arrows. But, I like the idea of not being able to dodge the arrows. I think that is a better way for our gameplay point of view. We might need to speed them up a little bit so it doesn't look quite so homing missile-ish, but it's as designed at the moment. So, awesome, great work. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you came up with some nifty arrows that you'd like to share with us, please do share in the community, and I'll see you in an upcoming video. Well, again, this video is going to be a problem and solution type video, where the problem, as I see it at the moment, is I can run over an extra weapon and my player ends up holding multiple weapons, which is kind of cool until you get to the point where you've got 10 weapons and you look like you're playing Katamari Damacy with all these things hanging off you. So we're going to resolve that. First of all, what I'd like to do is just create a second weapon pickup. So one for the bow, and to set our structure here so we're using prefab variants. Here's a little mini challenge for you. If you think you know how to do that, then go ahead and create a root pickup and then a sword and a bow variant from the pickup. So take on that challenge, otherwise we can do this together. I'm going to start by, I'll start by renaming this to be root pickup, and within my root pickup, jump into my prefab here, I'm going to delete the weapon prefab so we don't have any actual mesh sitting in there. We've got a sphere collider and a trigger, that's all good. The weapon itself, I will just switch to unarmed as my root, so there kind of is not really a weapon at this point, which is fine. Why bother making prefabs when it's all so simple? Well, in the future we might want to add sound effects or particle effects or other cool things to our pickups. We don't want to have to go and add all of them individually. We can just add them to the root. So right click, create, and where are we? Prefab variant. We'll recreate our sword pick up. Excellent. Double click on that. As we did before, find the sword. It's in Cinti prefabs down the bottom. Drag the sword underneath the sword pickup. Check that we have the sword zeroed. Yep, 0, 0, 0. I'm going to change the rotation to 90 so it's kind of lying flat on the ground. And then let's see how it fits within the collider. Not so well, so I need to move the weapon a little bit backwards on this axis to about there, it looks like. A little bit backwards further to about there. So it's sitting roughly in the middle of my my sphere collider. Cool. Okay, so jump out of that. We'll just do a little bit of sanity check to make sure that worked properly. And I've just noticed while editing my video that I forgot to delete my previous sword pickup that's now sitting in my scene just with the root pickup. So it's lost its mesh. So make sure you delete your old pickups so that they're not going to get in the way and be little invisible death traps. And scroll down to pickups, drop the sword pickup into our scene, run over the sword pickup, run. One thing we do need to put on our pickups is a little bit of that worked, but it didn't go into the hand because I forgot to tell it that it is a sword. So there we are, just there. That should work. Sword, excellent. One last check so I don't lead you down a dead end. Run. And awesome. Okay, then it becomes huge when we pick it up. I love it. Now let's create our bow. Again, right-click on root, create prefab variant. Call this bow pick up. Oh, I was in the middle of saying one thing that would be really cool is to add a little bit of light, a little bit of sparkle on the pickup so you can see them in the world and you know exactly, aha, there's a pickup, because they're a little bit disappearing into our world at the moment. But we'll do that later. For now, I need to grab my bow asset, which should be under Game Dev TV Assets, I believe. Simple bow, prefab, drag that underneath bow pickup. Excellent. Double click, right click, reset that as we did in the past. Okay, I know this is covering territory again, but should be pretty straightforward. Rotate 90, laying flat, good, done, excellent. Just make sure it's sitting in the middle. It's not. There we go, in the middle of our pickup. Not quite in the middle still. Done this a couple of times. There we go. Okay, looking sharp. While we're here, make sure we say that this is a bow. It's the bow with the blue projectile. And back into our game. Drop one of these into the scene. Find our pickups. Bow pickup, drop it into the scene. Okay, I'm just going to put these a little bit more where I can see them a bit easier. Probably make them bigger. We should probably put them on top of stuff soon. We'll add a little bit of set dressing to our world and make it a little bit spiffier, but we're just doing functionality at this point in time. So next I'll click on the player. Return the player to default weapon being unarmed. Click on play. Okay, run, pick up the sword, bloink, huge, pick up the bow. Yep, okay, so we can pick things up as intended. Great. Just going to apply this one back to the prefab. Apply, override in prefab player. Okay, great. Now let's go have a look at our scripts. We'll have a look at our weapon script, combat and weapon. This is where we need to make some changes. Now within our weapon class here, when we spawn, the first thing we want to do is to destroy the old weapon if we have an old weapon. So we're going to be making a new method that'll be destroy old weapon, and then giving it some logic to say check your right hand, check your left hand, and destroy whatever you find in either of those hands. And throughout this, we're going to be using a string reference to weapon because we'll be using the find method, and the find is looking for a string reference. Find and then something. And so instead of having to have a string references scattered throughout our code here, which gets a little bit messy and clunky, we're going to use a const. So const string weapon name equals weapon, semicolon. That way we can be just using weapon name. It's a nicer, cleaner way for us to be changing things or accessing this particular string reference that we have here. Okay, so it'll all make sense if you haven't used that technique before, it'll make sense in a moment. Under spawn, we will call our method that we haven't created just yet, destroy old weapon, and we need to be passing in right hand and left hand so that we can check those two. That's great. And then after we instantiate, well actually when we instantiate, we want to instantiate as a game object so that we have a reference that we can access. So game object, we'll add this in front of instantiate, we will call this weapon, and that will equal our instantiation. And then we are going to say weapon.name equals what? Micro challenge for you here, equals weapon name. One of our easier micro challenges, I suspect. Okay, that's cool. Now, copy my destroy old weapon, or just extract it as a method. But I'm going to copy it and type out private void destroy old weapon. We need to require the arguments of right hand and left hand. So transform right hand, transform left hand. And then we're going to check in both of the hands. So first of all, we will create a variable which we'll call old weapon. Could call old weapon or previous weapon or current weapon I want to destroy, and this will be of type transform. We just need to know where it is or what it is. Like, yes, there is one. and that we will define as right hand dot find, because we're looking in the right hand and we're trying to find a particular string reference. Our string reference is weapon name that we've nicely turned into our const variable up the top. Okay, so we're looking for, is there something in the right hand? Now, if old weapon that we've just looked in our right hand, if old weapon is null, if there's no weapon in our right hand, basically, then what we want to do is old weapon now equals what? What's it going to equal if it's not in the right hand? It's going to equal left hand dot find weapon name. And then if old weapon is again equal to null, then we want to return. Nothing to do here. We don't have a weapon. Nothing to be destroyed. All is well. However, if we have found a weapon, then what we want to say is destroy old weapon dot game object. So essentially, if we find a game object in the right hand, that's a weapon in the right hand or in the left hand, then we destroy it. Now, there's one little technicality. I won't take you through the debugging of this, the pain of trying to hunt down and make this bug appear, but because there's a little bit of an order issue or a frame issue, or when things get called, we need to change the name from weapon for this old weapon that we're destroying. So at this point, right before we destroy, we're going to say old weapon.name equals destroying. We'll write this in capitals so it's very clear. And essentially that's going to make sure that we don't have an issue where we've picked up a new weapon and there's a confusion around, is it the new weapon that we just picked up a second ago, or is it the old weapon that we already had in our hands? So within destroy old weapon, we are going to find that old weapon, rename it to destroying, and then that will allow us to destroy the old weapon without having confusion over the naming, the new one being named weapon, and so on. So that's just one of those things that we've found through our playtesting. We get a bit of an issue if we don't rename it right before we destroy it. So let's save all that up. There's the code. We'll jump back into Unity, see if this works. We've got our two weapons. We start off with no weapon, I believe, unarmed. Okay, let's run over the first weapon. Yes, we pick up a sword. Run over the second weapon. Yes, that works. We'll see if we can shoot. Run over here. Shoot a few times. Bow, bow, and success, I think. There he goes. So, great work, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, welcome back. We're going to make our projectiles a little bit spiffier by having the option to have some missiles heat-seeking and other missiles, like this blue one's not heat-seeking, it's just going in a straight line. We're also going to fix a couple of issues with wonky behavior when you shoot enemies and the arrow's not behaving as expected. So let's jump in and get cracking. Just a quick bit of tidy up from my last lecture. I left a sword pickup lying around in my scene, but it doesn't have a mesh, so each time I ran over it, my weapon disappeared. Confused me no ends. Thanks, Sam, for pointing out how simple it was to fix that if I'd just paid attention. So I'm going to delete that old sword pickup and then find my two other sword pickups I've created and drag that into my pickup folder, or my pickup game object, sorry. And that's pretty good. I've got an archer that's not in my enemies, so just doing a little bit of tidy up and put him into the enemies folder. That is fine for now. Okay, so at the moment, as you know, our projectiles are homing missiles, which I think is really cool, but I'd like to have the option to have sometimes homing missiles, sometimes not, or at least to be able to turn it off so that we don't get this. I think with a fireball, this kind of looks cool, but with an arrow, it looks a little bit hokey. So I'll keep it in as a fireball behavior, but take it out as an arrow behavior. And then the other thing that a bunch of folks in our community have pointed out is a couple of issues we're having. So I'm going to find my, find my projectile. So projectiles, blue arrow, open prefab, speed, change this down to 10 so that we can see this issue more readily. I'm also going to increase the distance that my player can shoot. So where are we? Bow. And the bow with blue projectile, weapon range 20. Okay, just so I don't have to get quite so close to my enemy. Let me show you what I'm seeing at the moment here. I think these arrows are a little bit too slow, but you might want to have your arrows slower. By the time my arrow is mid-air, I've shot another one, and you can see it's hitting the collider and disappearing. So it's kind of as if we're hitting the enemy all over again, which is a bit silly. If the enemy's dead, I want it to go flying off into the distance and acknowledge the fact that there is no enemy there anymore. So that's one of the issues that I've seen, and when we play around with it a little bit, we can introduce other issues where the arrow kind of just stops mid-air. of the arrow sticks and stays around and jitters. So as a challenge I'm going to give to you is implementing a couple of bits of functionality and also seeing if you can find those couple of bugs or a couple of issues when we do play around with our functionality. So we're tweaking our projectile code, the functionality. First of all, see if you can make our projectile go in a straight line instead of being a homing missile or homing projectile. This is a pretty straightforward fix, something you should be able to figure out even if you don't take on the other parts of the challenge. The second part of functionality is, hey, let's create an option to select if the projectile is a homing projectile or is not a homing projectile. So, for example, when we implement our fireballs pretty soon, maybe they follow the target no matter what, but our arrows don't follow the target, and we don't want to have to go and create a whole new script. So within our projectile script, how do we do that? So you can select, is this particular projectile homing or not homing? And then to fix these issues, as they arise, as we make these changes in here, new ones might come up, hopefully not too many. First of all, the projectile gets stuck in the dead target's collider. If the target is dead, we want the projectile just to go flying off into the distance. And we also have an issue where the projectile stays in one spot. If the target dies before the projectile reaches it, your arrow just sort of pauses mid-air, is one of the things that I've found. So all this is going to be in one script, just the projectile script. In that class, see if you can figure out how to improve the functionality of our projectile, and I'll see you back here when you've given it your best shot. Remember, even if you only take on one aspect of this, that's better than taking on no aspects of it. So give it your best shot. I'll see you back here in a moment. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, have a look in my projectile code, is to say, what do we need to do so that we can have something that goes in a straight line is not homing? So update. Our big hint here is we're looking at something every frame. So if something's moving around, then we're changing our look at position. So I think I could just grab this, create a start, and tidy up my brackets a little bit. And I'm going to copy the look at, and put it into start. So the very first thing we do when this projectile is instantiated is it looks at the target and says, aha, there's the target right now. Now, if I don't want it to be going towards the target every frame, I can just comment this out. I'm not going to delete it because I'm going to put it back in a moment when we want to toggle between homing and not homing, we're no longer on update looking at our target. So it should be as simple as that. Let's save that up and see if it works, where all of our projectiles now should no longer be homing missiles. So I'm going to see if my enemy run, and yep, I can dodge out of the way, which, is really pretty cool. I think we could have an enemy that shoots big, slow things, and you kind of have to dodge the gauntlet as you're trying to get past the guy. I think that'd be quite interesting. So we've now officially made all of our projectiles not homing missiles, which is kind of cool, but we want the ability to say some projectiles are, some projectiles are not. So how are we going to go about doing that? Well, I have decided to add a bool as a new variable at the top. So serialize field, this will be a bool, and we'll call this what? Is homing. And I'll initialize that at true. So our projectiles do start off being homing projectiles. And then within my update, I'm going to put back in, or uncomment, my look at, and I need a little bit of logic in here. What logic do you think we need? I think it's going to be as simple as saying if is homing, then in that instance we're going to look at the target. So therefore, if it returns false, then we're not going to look at the target. Let's see how that goes. Save that up, jump back over. I will make the red projectile. Let's go find the projectiles. The red projectiles, open them up. We will have them as is homing. Yes, that's good. We'll start with that. And then, you know what? I'll give my one of the other guys in the scene, so I don't have to do this, take too long. This guy here with the blue arrow will make this not homing. Okay, so open up our arrow projectile blue. Switch off is homing, and then I need to find that enemy who's holding that and give him a bigger attack range, I think. Who is that there? This is Bob. G'day, Bob. Now, where are you for your distance? Distance. Chase distance, we need to put that up to 20. Okay, now Bob should shoot at us with a non-homing and the other guy, yep, homing and not homing. Okay, so we've got that two different, you can see the blue arrows are just going straight and the red arrows are curving. Success! Okay, so we now have the option to have homing missiles and not homing missiles. Now, let's look at the other issues. What was in our list just here? Projectile getting stuck and projectile stays. Okay, cool. We're going to be using is dead. a bunch in this to see whether something is dead or not. So let's see, did I call this guy Bob? I think I did. Bob, for now, I'm going to move him out of the way so we don't get shot and killed too quickly. Actually, you know, I'll leave Bob there and I'll just give the player tons of health. That's probably the smarter way to do this. Health points, 600. Just so I'm not going to die halfway through showing you what's going on. Okay, now I want my projectiles to be nice and slow so that I can kill this first guy, but still be shooting another projectile before he's dead. Okay, yeah, you can see I've got a few on the way. When he dies, let's see what behavior happens. They kind of bonk, 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 just kind of blink out into nowhere. So let's look and see what we need to do here. Well, if we scroll all the way down to on trigger enter, so our dead enemy, we're still colliding with it with our arrow that thinks the enemy is alive. So let's put in a line here before we are trying to give damage. Let's just type in if target is dead, then what are we going to do? We'll return. It's basically at this moment where we collide with the enemy, we say, is the enemy dead? If so, then don't try to be giving any damage, and in particular, don't destroy the game object. We don't want it to go blunk into a kind of a nothing collider and burn out. So let's save that, see how that functionality goes. Basically, we want it to be flying off into the distance. We'll probably have to create another mechanism for destroying it after a certain amount of time, so it doesn't just go sailing into the beyond forever and ever, but there we go. Okay, that's cool. Look at that. It just went sailing off, sailing off. Nice. Now, I think if we turn on projectile is homing, we get some other sorts of behavior that might break it again. So let's put homing back on for our blue missiles. This is part of the bug testing. You have to test it with homing on, with homing off. If the enemy shoots at me, I shoot at the enemy running around. So you want to make sure you move it up a little bit and don't just do exactly the same thing each time. Okay, shoot, shoot, shoot. And then boink, and you see this interesting behavior. Let me pause and jump into the scene. You can see the arrow is just kind of sticking around, hanging around. So that is an issue with homing, because when we go and have a look at our homing logic here, it's saying if he's homing, yep, then keep looking at the target. So we just need to say that if the target is dead, stop looking at it. So is homing and exclamation mark. So is not target dot is dead. That should protect us against the case of homing missiles trying to stick around the dead body and kind of add insult into injury and be like, haha. What's that called? Teabagging someone? Maybe that's a different thing. No, I think that is when you play a first-person shooter. Don't go look that up online if you don't know what that means. Okay, shooting, 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 and off into the distance. I think that is it. I think we found all of our issues. If you find anything else, any other bugs we've introduced, or any other kind of weirdness, if you make the arrow super fast or make the arrow super slow, then you might introduce something else. But generally, this is the speed we'd want to have our magic fireball kind of things. I think that's okay. Any slower than that is a little bit ridiculous. We haven't really planned for our game to go much slower, and we still want to be able to see when we shoot our arrows. So we haven't planned for the arrows to go like 1,000 frames per second. We want to have it still reasonable. So you might find some really crazy outliers, but generally the game is intended for the arrows to go between, projectiles to go from that speed to that faster speed. Okay, so there we have it. Let us know in the comments how you went with figuring out this. Is this the right sort of challenge for you? Was it too easy? Was it too difficult? Did you like it? Do you like the whole put your sleuthing hat on and try to figure out what the issue is? And give us some feedback on that and let us know how you went. And I will see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome again. In the next couple of lectures, we're going to be making ourselves a fireball projectile weapon that we'll be equipping to our player to be able to shoot. And I've broken it out into more than just one lecture because I was trying to create one lecture and it was becoming massive. So I've broken it out into a couple. And what we're going to do in this video is set up the structure, the framework of making the weapon, having the pickup, and equipping it to the player so that we've got something we can shoot and start testing in the next video. So I'm going to give this to you as a challenge. We've done it a few times, so it should be straightforward, but I want you to be doing this of your own accord. Make a fireball weapon, make a fireball projectile. Don't worry about what it looks like yet. That will be the subject for the next lecture. For now, just duplicate the root arrow prefab and rename that as fireball and start using that. Make a fireball pickup, allows the player to have the fireball weapon, and then equip it and test. So there's your challenge. Jump in, take that on. I'll see you back here when you're done. Okay, let's get over into weapons. Right click, create folder, and we'll call this fireball. And within the fireball weapon, we want to right click, create weapons, make new weapon, and we'll call this fireball. This is our scriptable object. We also need to right click, create animator override controller, which we'll call fireball animator override. Okay, and I've forgotten a few times when I've been prototyping to go and change the controller here so that we are using the character controller that we're overriding. Now, while we're here, we'll put in a some sort of animation. For my character, I'm not going to use a staff or a wand or something. I'm just having the fireball come out of his hand, but you could absolutely put a weapon or a symbol or something in his hand. That'd be cool. I'm going to select as my animation in here. We should have something in our pack, which is the item attack. That's what I'll use. If you, like I say, if you've got a weapon or a staff or something, you might want to use one of the other animations. Now, into fireball, let's change the animator override to be the fireball animator override. Prefab, as I'm mentioning, I'm not going to have a prefab in here, but you could absolutely have a staff or something. Damage I'm going to leave low so we don't kill our dude just yet. And projectile, we haven't made that just yet. We'll do that now. Side note, I don't think I mentioned, I just grabbed one of my enemies and popped him over here and put his chase radius down to 2 so that we can just do some little playtesting and prototyping over here. Now, projectiles. We've got our arrow projectile. This is our root projectile. I'm just going to rename this root arrow projectile and put a space in between. Similar to what we did with our pickups. We've got our root pickup. So we've got our root arrow projectile, and then so these spaces don't bug me, I'm just going to put a space between arrow projectile blue and arrow projectile red. You don't have to, I'm just tidying up a little bit. And then from the root arrow projectile, I'm going to duplicate that and I'm going to rename this to fireball projectile. In the future, I might make this my root and then do a prefab variant off the fireball and prefab variants off this others. But for now, I'll just have this as my my one projectile I'll work on, because I'm not sure if I'm going to make other spell projectiles just yet. So, got our fireball projectile. Where do we need to place that? Well, we need to go to our fireball and then grab our projectile and drag it on over. Fireball projectile, which is going to look like an arrow. Side note, if you're holding it and you drag across the screen, the trail from the back of our projectile, you can see how it looks, which is kind of cool. Now, let's just drop it in the player's hand to make sure we know it works. So, default weapon, instead of unarmed, I will have as the fireball. And I think I've missed a step in here. Let me go have a look at my fireball weapon. Fireball, what's the range? I want to have the range much further. We'll say 20, because it's going to be a distance weapon. Okay, run over to where the enemy is. Click on the enemy. Okay, and he throws. So if you imagine that this is a fireball, not our arrow projectile, I think it's going to look pretty nifty. We've got the base functionality in there working pretty well. I think we will need to slow down the speed of our fireball. So we'll do that now. Projectiles, fireball projectile, open up that, change the speed down to, say, 8, and leave everything else as it is for now, because we want a way of visualizing it before we go and put our nifty fireball particle system on our fireball, and just double check that this is working okay. Whoops. Click on you. Brr, bam. Okay, it's like a magic missile now, isn't it? If you've played Dungeons and Dragons, you'll know about magic missiles. Very cool. Now we want to make a pickup, so that we've got all of our functionality in place. Let's go to our pickups. Got our root pickup, right click, create prefab variant. We'll call this fireball pickup. In the future, we might have this as a spell or as a potion or as a mana recharge, but at this point, we're working on the weapon functionality as opposed to the resource functionality. Let's open up our fireball pickup. In here, you can see that it's kind of empty. We don't have anything in there because it's based straight on the root. What do we want to have as our visualization? I'm going to go into my asset packs, find the Cinti asset pack, find the prefabs, and then just control and scroll to make this slider go up. I think I'm going to use this little flower thing. Okay, use a flower, drag that under fireball pickup, and then make it bigger, maybe like 3, 3, 3. Okay, it looks big, kind of looks a bit fiery, that's why I chose it. A little bit random in a way, and we need to move it over to the left. So it's roughly in the middle. Okay, roughly good enough. Back to our scene and find our pickups folder. Yes, there it is. Drag our newly created pickup, which should be in our pickups folder. fireball pickup. Excellent, I'm just going to go back to having my text here. Fireball pickup, drag that into pickups. Move it in front of the dude here. Up in there a little bit. Okay, and also while we're on the fireball pickup, we need to make sure that it knows what it is assigning as the weapon. So weapon pickup, we will make this the fireball. Okay, that should be enough to test it out. Click on play. Now I'm currently equipped with the fireball, so I have to run over and pick up the sword. Bloink, run over and pick up the fireball. There we go. And bam, there we go. Okay, so everything in place now with our functionality, with the exception of the projectile itself, which we will do in the next video. So great work, and see you again shortly. In this video, we're going to make our fireball look more like a fireball. There it is. So let's jump in and make some fireballs. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the asset store and grab some particles. And once again, I'm using the assets from our good friends at Cinti. They've made a simple FX cartoon particles. You can search for simple FX. Click on that. That will take you to a very cool, very blocky, voxely looking particle system, which is the style I'm going for in my game. You might want something different. But this is the one I'll be using. Import that. You'll have to download it first if you haven't already. I've already downloaded it. Import that into your project. Should be pretty quick. And like I say, if you want to go for a different style, absolutely. We don't need a lot of particles for this exercise, just something that can look fireball-ish. Now that has landed inside our assets. I'm going to drag that just underneath asset packs so it's in the same spot that our other assets are. Now we need to find our projectile. Double click on the fireball projectile. At the moment it looks like an arrow, which is not what we want. We want to grab the arrow and delete it, and the trail and delete that as well. I'm going to be doing two parts to this projectile. One will be the fireball head, and the other part will be the fireball trail. And each of these offer us some ways of learning different things about the particle system. I'm going to assume that you've seen Unity's particle system before. If you haven't, you might want to check out one of our introductory courses, the Unity 2D or Unity 3D course. But if you haven't seen anything at all, it's cool. You can follow along with what I'm doing here. It should mostly make sense. So I'm going to go to my fireball projectile, right click, and let's see, effects, particle system. I'll rename this particle system to fireball head. Okay, now we're going to do a couple of things. You can see it starts off with our just standard default white blops. Just blops, is that what they are? I don't know, white ball things firing into the wherever. I'm going to change a couple of things. First of all, what I want to do is just have one single particle that spins around. That's a little bit of a new concept, rather than just having this emitter with a whole bunch of particles making this kind of wave of things going on. We're going to have one particle. So click on emission, rate over time, we'll make that 0, and under bursts, click the plus, we're going to have a count of 1. So a burst where there's one thing that comes out, and there it goes, the one thing. And because we've got a duration of 5 seconds on our particle system and a lifetime of 5 seconds, every 5 seconds we're going to get a new particle that lasts for 5 seconds. We don't want it to be flying through the air, so I'm going to find the start speed, or is it here, start speed, and put that to 0. Now it's just sitting right there. It's not sitting exactly on our origin point because we have a shape. I'm just going to turn off the shape, so it's going to be right smack bang in the middle. Now we want it to look a little bit different, so going down to renderer, click on renderer, and instead of render mode being billboard, I want to change this to being mesh. That means we can put in some sort of structure, some sort of game mesh in there, and the mesh I'm going to choose will be, click on my little selector here, I'm going to search for gun and find the SAFX gun flash. Double click on that. And that brings in that object that's going to kind of be a chunky fireball head. I think looks okay. You can use whatever you want here. You could just use a sphere. It could be as simple as just putting a little orb in there, and it would do the job just fine if you don't have this asset pack in particular. Now, I need to change the render alignment, because at the moment when I turn around, I'm not actually seeing the back of it. So change your render alignment to local. Now I can see it from side on. I can see that my Z-axis forward is that way, and I want that my head to be moving that way. So I'm going to go all the way up to the top and change the rotation to 180, basically to turn it around the other way. That's exactly what we wanted. Back down to renderer again. Let's give it a slightly nicer look, and to do that, click on material, just the selector again, search for gun flash, Double click on that, and now we see we've got this orange kind of thing that certainly looks like a fireball. Now we want this to be doing something. We want it to be kind of spinning around. So I'm going to find rotation over lifetime and click on that to select it, and then click to open it up. I'm going to change this to 500. So it's kind of spinning around, you know, doing fireball-y kind of stuff as it flows through the air, vroom, like that. I think that looks pretty cool. And then what else did we want to do in here? Let's see, simulation space local, yep, start color. This is all looking pretty good for now. Okay, so we've got a head for our object. Now we need to put in a trail. So let's go into our simple FX particles in here, find the prefabs, look for, there's going to be, a flamethrower. Grab the flamethrower, drag it so it's a child to the fireball projectile. You need to scroll out a little bit to see what's going on here. That looks pretty cool, right? That looks kind of like fireballish. We need to make a couple of tweaks and changes. So while clicking it on, click play. Now we don't want this to be kind of flame throwing out fire. We want it to be, as we move along, that's when the particles are emitted. So I'm going to change a couple of things here. First of all, we'll change the size and stuff. The start lifetime, I'll make 0.3, so it's smaller. And the start speed, I'm going to change down to 0.1. And now instead of having rate over time, because then if it goes really fast, we get this weird kind of blobby effect. If it goes really slow, it looks quite tight. Instead of rate over time, I'm going to go and find down here, let's see, emission, put rate over time to 0, and rate over distance, I'm going to make, say, 20. So then it's emitting based upon how far we've traveled. So if we travel a short distance, not much is coming out. Travel a long way, then lots comes out. So that'll allow us to change the speed of the fireball and still have a nice consistent emission going on there. What else do we need? Shape, we can leave that as a sphere, that's fine. So currently velocity over lifetime and limit velocity over lifetime. I don't believe we need velocity over lifetime. Controls the velocity of each particle during its lifetime. I'm going to turn that off, but I'm going to leave the limit velocity over lifetime, which controls the velocity limit and damping of each particle during its lifetime. So it puts a little bit of dampening on it, which is another way of saying things aren't going to move faster than we want them to move. If this thing's flying through the air, we're not going to get any weird kind of behavior with things being trying to be pushed around too quickly. So we'll just leave the limit velocity over lifetime on. Color over lifetime, leave that on. Size over lifetime, yep, all these things are looking pretty good. Rotation speed, great. Okay, now let's have a look at the size of things. We've got the fireball head, yep, we've got the flamethrower. That looks like it's way too big. So let's jump on up to the size. Start size, where are you? Start size, instead of 2, we'll make it 0.5. See how that feels? We've got to click on play. That's that size compared to the fireball head. It looks okay. I'm going to move the flamethrower back a little bit, so it's kind of starting a little bit behind the fireball head. Yeah, that's looking good, I think. And then where is our volume? Make sure our volume is aligned properly. It needs to be aligned, I think, just a little bit behind the front of the fireball head. So just flatten it out a little bit, squish it up a little bit, make it a bit wider so we've got a nice good hit volume. Yeah, that looks okay. And then push it back. There we go. Okay, now let's jump into the game and see how this actually works. See if it works. The player should have that all ready to go. Should have been equipped already. We'll run over, pick up our flower thing, shoot this guy. Oh, look at that fly through the air. Okay, that's pretty cool. A little bit of tweaking we need to do. But as I'm going to do my tweaking, I'm going to give you a challenge, which is to customize your fireball. You don't have to make it exactly the way I have. Make a fireball, make it look cool, and then please share it, a screenshot or a video. I'm going to do a little bit more tweaking of mine so you can see what I do, but please customize yours, make it yourself, make an ice ball. It doesn't have to be a fireball. Make it a lot more red, make the trail longer, add some smoke to it. There's smoke in the Cinti pack, so put your own flair to it and make it look really rad. So jump in, take on that challenge. I'm going to finish mine off, and I will show you my final values just very briefly when I'm done. I've got the fireball head, I made a tiny bit smaller to 0.7. I sped up its rotation to 700. The flamethrower itself, I didn't do a lot of. Start lifetime 0.4, start speed 0.2, and start size 0.4. Okay, and then all the other values should be as they were before. So there it is. There's our flamethrowery projectile fireball thing. That's the word I'm after, fireball. There's still a little bit of polish to make this moment really sing, but pretty happy with this. So great work, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to add hit impacts for our projectiles so that when things land, kaboom, we spray a little particle effect to give a bit of visual feedback that you've landed your target. So let's jump in and get started. To make this process a little bit simpler, I've given you a fireball impact that you can go ahead and download against this lecture and then drag on into your project. Import that, should all go in the right places. It's probably created an effects folder. So game effects, and there's the fireball impact. Just drag it in so you can see. Blunk, it's just a little impact like that. Sitting in effects called fireball impact. Okay, so we need to open up our projectile script at the start, at the top I mean. We need to add a serialized field. That will be of type game object, and we'll call that hit effect. And we'll initialize that at null. Now, I'm going to scroll on down and show you the location where I'm going to put our instantiation. So the moment where the impact takes place, kaboom, we want to instantiate the fireball impact at the position where the impact took place. So I'm going to give you that to you as a challenge. Instantiate the impact effect. Instantiate a fireball impact effect at the point of impact. Okay, summarize that 3 times now. There's your challenge. Take that on. See you back here when you've given it a shot. So on trigger enter, I'm going to go all the way down just before our destroy. I'm going to add a new line, which is if hit effect is not null, so we'll protect against null in this instance, is not null, then what are we going to do? Well, we want to instantiate. So if we've got a hit effect, we want to instantiate. It will be the hit effect that we just created a variable of. Where is it going to be? Let's have a look and see what we've got access to. We've got get aim location, that is basically where we are trying to shoot at. So we'll use that as our position. So get aim location, parentheses, and then the rotation will just say transform.rotation, semicolon. Okay, we'll save that, jump back into Unity, and then find my fireball projectile. So fireball projectile, there we go. Open up the prefab. You can see now we have a place for our hit effect. I'm going to find my new effect I just brought in, fireball impact, drag that on over. That should be pretty good. Click on play. If I don't have the fireball equipped, I can run over my little fireball symbol-y thing there and shoot and see what happens. And kaboom, we have this effect that plays. Really cool, I like it. Nice and simple, straightforward, having a fireball effect. So what we could be doing is adding an impact effect for all of our projectiles. Let's just go ahead and quickly make a variant of the fireball impact. So I'm going to right click, create, let's see, prefab variant. I'll call this generic impact effect. Okay, because I'm not sure where I'm going to use it. I'll probably just use it for my arrows for now. I might color it, I might not, but I'm just going to make one here, see if we can go through this process to make it work. Open that up, and we've got our kaboom. I'm going to scroll out a little bit, play that. Okay, make it a lot smaller, so start size from we'll say 0.01 to 0.1. See how that looks. Yep, and then we'll make the start speed between 2 and 4, so it shouldn't go as far. Boosh, boof. Okay, and then I'm going to narrow the whole shape down a whole bunch, so it's more of a, if it's an arrow strike, it's going to be in a tighter area, I think. Play, boink, and then we'll change the color to make it a little bit more neutral. I've got this color over lifetime. Click on that selector. Now I've got a whole bunch of presets I've created already, but you can go in and add new selector things. You can delete them. You can change the color. I think you've probably done that enough before, so you know how it works. Transparency up the top, color down the bottom. Double click to add a new one. I'm going to just choose one of my other ones I've created previously. This one that looks a little bit wacky. It's got greens and yellows. Okay, just to differentiate it from what we had previously. And you know what? I'm going to do one last little tweak. I'm going to have this last for a shorter amount of time, but go faster, I think, from, we'll say, 10 to 15. So start lifetime 0.1 to 0.2, and start speed 10 to 15. Bam, bam. Okay, I think that looks okay. Now, we've got our generic hit impact. Jump back into our other projectiles. We'll find the arrow projectile blue. We will give that the hit effect of generic hit effect. Awesome. And then I'm going to find my projectile red. Do the same thing. Effects, generic impact effect. Of course, I could be adding this to my root arrow projectile. That would be a place to put this. So my hit effect is the generic hit effect. That would be a smarter thing to do, wouldn't it? So generic hit impact is on our projectile at the root level, so particularly for our arrows, it means they'll all get that. I've also gone and added it to the blue and the red. I didn't need to do that, but we've got all our bases covered now, haven't we? So I'm going to click on play, run over to my bow and arrows so that I actually am shooting the blue arrows, and we'll see how this looks. And poop. Okay, they're hitting me, I'm hitting them. So I recommend you go and create a red one and maybe make this blue one a little bit more blue. I've got it a little bit green in my approach here, but you can see that I'm actually landing it and having that moment of impact, which I think makes our arrows and our missiles and all that kind of stuff a lot more interesting. So there we go. That's a quick one for this lecture. Great work, and I'll see you again shortly. Hello, we're nearly finished this section. We've got a little bit of cleaning up that we need to do, and I'm going to give us another one of our problem solution style videos. So let's have a look at the problems we've got at the moment, mostly to do with destroying things. So one, when we're shooting and we're instantiating our cool particle effect, you can see we've got all of our impact effects just gunking up our hierarchy. We need to tidy that up. Another thing, when we kill our target, you can see that this fireball, where is it? It's going and going and going forever, and that's something that we want to address and make sure it doesn't do that. And finally, the last thing is we've got a few different components to our fireball, and that's cool for us to be able to have. We're going to create a little bit of functionality so that, let me just pause this and get into my scene here, so that we can have different aspects of our fireball be destroyed at different times. So you can see as we're going along here, the head of the fireball and the trail, the moment we impact, boom, the whole thing blinks out of existence. We're kind of covering it up with the impact, so you don't see it so much, but you might not have such a big impact, or you might want to have that a little bit more subtle so that we can, for example, destroy the head of the fireball and then let the particle finish off doing what the particle wants to do. So they're the three things we're going to do. I've broken this out as challenges so that you can have a look at it. We'll be cleaning out the following: destroying our impact effect after it's finished, stopping the orphaned projectiles flying on forever, and destroying different parts of the projectile at different times. If you want to take on all of those challenges now, here's the time. If you want to take them on one at a time and see how you go, I'm going to do the first one first, and you can give that a shot, and then I'll show you my solution. And then if you feel like it, you can give the second one a go, and so on. So first up, let's work on destroying our hit impact after it's finished doing it. Hit impacts do. First of all, I'm going to find where is my hit impact. It's on my effects here. We've got the fireball impact and we've got the generic impact effect. I'm going to create a script which will just be a pretty generic destroy after the effect is done script. So we'll go into our scripts folder. I think this is more in core than it is in combat. I'm going to right click, create C# script, and I will call this destroy after effect. Effect or effects? We'll say effect. Singular, I think. And then open that up in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to get rid of the start method. We don't need that. And as always, don't really need to be reminded what an update does. I think we know that by now. What I do want to do is to say, if we don't have a particle system, or if the particle system is not alive, and this is a method that we can call upon. I know as a challenge, I didn't really give you a clue for this, so it might have been tricky, but you might have known the answer already. Okay, enough waffle. Let's start. If we do not have, or there is not, a get component. What sort of component are we looking for? We're looking for the particle system dot, and in here we have a mechanism. You see the very first option here is alive. That's returning a bool. So if basically when we look for the particle system, it's not alive, meaning that the particle system itself is no longer alive, no longer producing particles, then pretty simply we just destroy this game object. Bow. Save that, and we'll go find the game object we're going to attach that to. Effects, let's see just here. Jump into my fireball impact, click on add component, destroy after effect, and that should be added nicely. And then over to my generic impact effect, open prefab, same thing, add component, destroy after effect. Well, it's already been added because this one, I believe, was the prefab variant of the fireball impact. Okay, probably could deserve a little bit of a rename to make that clearer. The generic impact effect is actually a prefab variant of Fireball Impact, so I'll let you play around with that. I'm probably not going to do too much more with this myself in my particular game, so I'll leave that to you. However you want to structure it, make sure it makes sense to you which one is the prefab variant of which other one. Let's see if that's worked. We'll jump on over into the game. We'll fire off some fireballs. Run on over. Shoot. Whoops. Not so close, buddy. Shoot. And you see we have an impact that is quickly produced, then quickly destroyed. So, yep, success. We have successfully tidied that up. Okay, on to our next thing. What's next on our challenge? Stopping orphan projectiles flying on forever. This one is a more simple challenge, so if you want to give this your best shot, how do we make it that we just don't have them go on and on and on? We want to have a maximum limit on them. So let's go over to our projectile script. I'm going to make myself a new variable up the top here, serialized field. I'm going to put it in the right spot first of all. Serialized field. This will be of type float, and we'll just call this max lifetime. And what is a good maximum lifetime we want to have as our default? Probably something's not going to need to stay on the screen for more than 10 seconds, so we'll start that off at 10. So where shall we destroy our projectile? I think under set target, that's right at the start of our projectile coming into existence. We will simply just say destroy. What are we destroying? Again, it's game object, and after how long? Max lifetime. Okay, we'll save that. Jump on over, see if that's worked again. Run, 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 and shoot, shoot, shoot. 1, 2. How many does this take? About 6 or 7. After we do that, we'll get this one fly off into the nowhere. And okay, and this is going to take 10 seconds. I might speed up the video here. And it is destroyed itself. Excellent. So far, two down, 1 to go. Let's have a look at the third one. Destroying the different parts of the projectile at different times. Okay, cool. So once again, let's get over into projectile. We need to give ourselves a concept, or we need to give ourselves the opportunity to say which things do we want to destroy on immediate impact. So I'm going to, again, serialize field, create a new variable up here, and this will be a game object type once again, but it will be an array, so that we can take in more than one. We might want to have 5 things that get destroyed and others that do not. So we'll call this destroy on collision, destroy on hit, we'll call it. We'll start that off at null, initialize that at null, and then within our code, all the way down the bottom, so after we've bonked into something, we are destroying the game object. We don't want to destroy everything at that point, so just before this final destroy, let us say destroy the things that are within our, what do we call it? Destroy on hit array. So for each game object, and we'll call it to destroy, which game objects we want to destroy in destroy on hit, what are we going to do? Well, just pretty straightforward. We destroy all of the to destroy. Semicolon. Okay, that's cool. So we've got all these things that we destroy immediately, but now this is also happening immediately, so destroying everything immediately. So we want to have something in here, comma, a certain amount of time, which we'll call life after destroy, life after impact. I think life after impact. So how long do we want it to live after impact? Making my variable a bit backwards here. Copy this all the way up to the top. Add ourselves another serialized field. This will be of type float and called life after impact, and I'll initialize that at 2. Okay, so make sure it's all cleaned up and tidied up. If you have any projectile stuff going on that you want to linger around, like some smoke or something linger around for a while, you may want to make it more than 2. So now we need to go over to our fireball projectile. That's the main one. I won't worry about doing it with the arrow at the moment, because the fireball is the one I'm interested in. And you see our destroy on hit array, I'm going to make it of size 1, and that will give us one thing, the fireball head, that I'll drag in as the game object. That will be destroyed immediately. Everything else will be destroyed after 2 seconds, that we've got the 2 seconds just in here. Okay, let's see how this one goes. Click on play. Very excited. Boop-a-doop, and click. I'll need to pause and get in all nice and close. It's all set up for us. Step ahead, step ahead. Okay, so you can see on impact, the trail is still living. The head has been destroyed, and then the trail gets time to resolve the remainder of its kind of flying into the dude. and then sticking around for probably a little bit too long. So let's adjust that a little bit. Open up our file, Fireball Prefab, 0.2. I can also go into the projectile itself, into the flamethrower, and change this duration so it's lower. I think that would make sense as well, so that we're not having all this time after the fireball has hit, that it's still sitting there generating its particles. But for now, I'll solve it the other way just by changing up that value we have on here, life after impact 0.2. But those are the two levers that you can pull. As again, these things aren't exact sciences. Sometimes you have to fiddle and tune and tweak until you get the look you're going for. So we'll throw this fireball. Okay, and that looks pretty good. We get a little bit of that trail of the fireball. Boom, 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 boom. Yep, and it sticks around for a little bit of time. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, a couple more things to tidy up, and before we wrap up, I think I've gone and broken our arrows. Let's have a look at those. A couple of reasons why. First of all, let's see what's going on. It hits me and boom, goes flying straight through. So first of all, what we can do is say, well, we want to have the arrowhead destroyed upon impact. So I'm going to go to my root arrow projectile, open prefab, find the destroy on hit, change that to 1, and drag in the simple arrow. That should destroy the arrow, and for our prefab variants, that should work as well. What we need to do in our projectile class is to scroll down and say that upon impact, we want our arrow, or we want our projectile, to have a speed of 0, so that it doesn't try to keep going. Let's see, it doesn't try to keep going straight through our target. So that will also help us in this instance. Underneath take damage, before we play our hit effect, I'm going to add in here speed equals 0. And the speed I'm referring to here is our instance variable speed, right up our very top there, so the speed of the projectile. Let's save that and see what sort of impact that has with those two changes. Run, 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 stand in the middle of the bridge. Boom. Missed me, got me, got me. Okay, so we'll slow it down and see what's happening with the trail here, just to make sure the trail's behaving as we'd expect it to behave. The red one's coming in and hits me, bam, and then the trail slowly disappears. I think that's awesome. Pretty good, and success. Okay, another thing I'll do with effects, I've been thinking about this and getting lots of great feedback from people. This is really dumbly named. So I created my first impact here, which was the fireball, put a lot of effort into that, and then said, well, let's use a prefab variant, but then I went and called it generic impact effect, which doesn't make any sense. I'm using this as an arrow impact effect. So now it's okay for the arrow impact, I think, from a naming point of view, to be a prefab variant of the fireball. And if we were to create another layer of effects underneath this, we probably would want to rename the fireball impact. So it's very clear that this is the prefab parent, if you will, of the other variants that come underneath it. But for now, I'm comfortable that this is differentiated enough. The other thing we need to do is go into projectile and put this in a namespace. I've totally forgotten to do that, so I'm going to highlight everything in here, cut up at the top, namespace, and it will be namespace RPG dot, what are we in here? We're in combat. And then paste all that inside. Excellente. Save that up. We also need to do the same thing for, what did we create recently that I didn't namespace? Under core, we have destroy after effect. Destroy after effects, let's highlight everything in here. Boink. Cut all that. Namespace. And the namespace is going to be RPG dot core. Core. That's what you say when you're really impressed with something in Australia. Core. Check that out. Okay, so that's all looking pretty good. So let's just do one last quick run through, make sure everything's working as it should before I declare all my bugs and all my tidy ups done. Grab this thing, shoot that guy, fireball works, kaboom. Oh, I've got one last thing that I keep forgetting to do. Thank you for Sam pointing this out to me. Rick, what were you thinking? Can you guys spot? Here's a little sleuthing moment for you. See if you have the powerful brain that Sam Patuzzi has. What is wrong with this moment just here? Okay, what is wrong is we've got this guy throwing left-handed. Left-handed throws are tricky enough as it is, but the fireball's coming out of his right hand. Well done, Rick. Not really using your brain there. So fireball, click on the fireball, scriptable object, and turn off is right-handed. This is why we do our quality assurance testing. This is why QA testers in the industry Super valuable. Look at that now. It's actually coming out of the right spot. Well done. Hoorah. That looks okay. We'll pick up the bow. We'll let them shoot at me. Bams. Crunch. Crunch. I'll shoot at them. And do-do-do. Success. Okay. I can't see any issues here now. I'm sure there are some. If you've found anything else, please let me know in the comments, and Sam or I will come in and do some extra bug fixes. These things often don't come up until later on, but hopefully we've found everything. Hopefully your game is looking awesome. Please do share the latest screenshot, the latest video in our comments. We'd love to see where you're at with your game, and I'll see you in an upcoming lecture.
So we actually have a bug in the spawning of our weapon that we didn't cover in the last lecture because it's a bit more involved than some of the other little things that we tidied up. So the problem is around here in this setting of the animator runtime controller, and let me show you what it is. If we go to an existing weapon, I'm going to go to the fireball and just for now remove its animator override controller. And you'd think, okay, this is great. Now we're going to use the punch animation to launch our fireball. And that's basically what we should be doing. So I pick up my sword first. You can see that I have my sword attack. That's great. But now, look, if I pick up the fireball instead, I'm actually still using my sword attack. And it looks pretty cool to launch a fireball using the sword attack. But that's not what we'd intended. We'd intended for it to use the default animation, which is the punch. So what's going wrong here is that the animator override that we have in our weapon is set to null. And so what it does is instead of setting it to a default value in the animator runtime, setting this runtime animator controller to a default value, it actually doesn't set it at all. So it's whatever it was set to before, which in our case was the last weapon that was equipped. So that's not really what we want. In fact, this runtime animator controller is just, if we go over to our player, it is just this controller here. It's the property that is said to be controller in the animator. So when we set an override controller, we're basically saying, hey, let's replace that with this fireball animator override. You can just do that even in the editor. I'm just going to undo that though, because we want our default controller to be there. So how can we go about replacing that when there's, for example, this fireball animator override controller? How can we say, okay, now we don't have an animator set, don't have an override set, we want to go back to that default? Well, the trick is in knowing that the way that the animator override controller inherits from each other. So the animator override controller, I've got to say this right, the runtime animator controller is the root class, whereas the animator override controller, if we go and have a look at that, you can have a look at the class definition for it. The animator override controller inherits from the runtime animator controller, and it adds a lot of stuff on top of it. And one of the properties that it has that the runtime animator controller does not have is this. It has a property called runtime animator controller. And what's that? That is just the property of which animator controller this override controller is overriding. So you can see that we have that on our animator override. For example, we can do animator override dot runtime animator controller, and that will get us to basically the parent, which is the thing we want to set here. So we'd like to basically do this, but this is the wrong logic, because this is in the case where we have an animator override controller to reference in the weapon. We don't have an animator override controller to reference when the animator override is null. So let's actually have a look. So in the case where it's null, we want to do an else, basically. Else, we are going to do this case that is null. And what we want to say is there's two situations, basically. Maybe the previous animator was already set to the default runtime animator controller, in which case we don't have to do anything. We'd know that because the type would be the runtime animator controller. The other situation is that it has already been overridden, in which case the type would be the animator override controller. How do we find out the type? Well, we can do it by trying to cast our animator runtime override controller. So let's try that. Animator runtime over controller, and we're going to try and cast it like this using the as operator, because if this fails it returns null. And then we're going to do animator try to cast it to the animator override controller. And I'm just going to go and store this in a variable. I'm going to use the var keyword here because we've just said what type it's going to be, and it's going to make the line really long if I don't use the var keyword. I'm going to call this the override controller. And basically, as I said, this will be null if the thing in here is just the runtime animator controller. It is just the root thing, the character animator controller. Otherwise, it will have the value of the runtime animator controller, or rather the animator override controller that is in the runtime animator controller slot. So we can use this to say, hang on, if this is not null, so if override controller is not null, then we want to go ahead and set the animator runtime animator controller to what? What do we want to set it to? So remember that the animator override controller has a property that points to its parent, the character in our case. What would that, how can you use that? Okay, so the way we're going to use that is to say the animator override and the animator runtime animator controller is going to be equal to the override controller's runtime animator controller. Basically, we're saying if it's already an override, find its parent and put that in the runtime animator slot instead. So that should do the trick. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of tidying up. I don't like this nesting of the if statements. I'm going to put this cast actually just outside of our if statements, like so. And then I'm going to turn this into an else if, like so. So it just takes away one level of nesting and keeps things a little bit tidier. Fix my indentation. Okay, now let's give that a shot. Let's see if it's going to work now. I've got to go and pick up the sword, first of all. We know that that switches over the animation to being the sword animation. Now, if I go and pick up the fireball, it should switch it back. It should say, hey, sword, what is your parent controller? And let's put that as the runtime override. Now, I'm going to cast, and there you go. We're using the punch animation to fire our fireballs. So that has fixed the bug. Hopefully you understand a little bit better the hierarchy between runtime animator controllers and animator override controllers as well. And we've got a working system. Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to be adding a new mono behavior called the base stats script, which is going to have two important properties: the starting level for this particular player or character, and then the character class, which could be any one of player, grunt, mage or archer in my game. In your game it might be different. Let's dive in and see why this class is important and how we're going to use it in the grander scheme of things. One of the key mechanics that differentiates an RPG from any other sort of game is progression, and the idea with progression is that you level up. As you go through the level, you encounter more and more difficult enemies, and their stats and the whole system increases. You can easily beat a lower level enemy, but you find it tricky with higher level enemies. One of the core mechanics. So one of the ways that we want to do this is give the designers the tools to implement the progression of our game. Now, the way typically designers like to think about this is in spreadsheets. So we often want to have tools for importing spreadsheets full of numerical values into our game. Now, we're not going to do that in this part of the course. We're going to do it in part 2. But we are going to have a central scriptable object where you can define the progression within Unity. So that's the idea. We've got our grunts and our player prefabs, which have got health and fighter components on them, which might want to know about certain stats, like what is my health, what is the damage that I do as a fighter. And that should be defined by the progression, which is going to be basically this big spreadsheet, this big scriptable object asset in Unity that is divided up like so. We start off with having all the stats for the grunt, and we have stats such as health and damage, and those stats are then broken down by level. So you've got the health at level 1, health at level 2, health at level 3, etc. And then we have the same thing going on for the player, and that's all broken down by level as well. I just haven't gone into the details showing it here because I don't have enough space on the slide. And then what we need to do to tie these two things together is to introduce this base stats scriptable object, sorry, not scriptable object, mono behavior, that's the one I mean, mono behavior on our grunt and on our player, which basically says, hey, I can provide you these stats from progression if you tell me what my class is. So, for example, the grunt is a grunt class, and the player is a player class, and what level you're at. Then what I can do is if you ask me for health, so example for the health component says, hey, base stats, what is my health? Then base stats goes off and consults the scriptable object, the progression, and says, hey, well, you are a grunt, and you're asking for health, and you're asking for health at level 2, so here is your health. That's the system that we want to put in place in the next few lectures, and it's the starting point at least, and then we've got lots to go from there, such as doing more and more attributes and serializing this and making sure it's all saved in the save system and gaining your experience points and leveling up and so on. But first of all, we've got to implement this basic structure and architecture. So I'm going to start off with implementing the base stats class. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new folder, first of all, in scripts. And I'm going to call this folder progression. No, actually, scratch that. I'm going to